collectivist-individualist intelligence paradox. In Western societies, like the US, Canada, or Germany, intelligence is often viewed as an internal, individual trait. You're either smart or you're not, and it usually shows up through logic, reasoning, verbal ability, academic scores, and how well you perform on your own. Kids are praised for speaking up, asking questions, being fast, and thinking independently. The whole system, from schools to job interviews, is structured to reward people who can stand out and shine as individuals. In contrast, many Eastern, African, and Indigenous cultures value something very different. Intelligence isn't necessarily about how fast you can answer a question or how clever you sound when debating. It's about how well you navigate life with others. It's about reading the room, maintaining harmony, respecting context, and understanding what's appropriate in a given situation. In these cultures, someone who interrupts, challenges authority openly, or tries to win an argument might actually be seen as immature, not intelligent. Now here's where things get interesting. When people from collectivist societies take Western-style IQ tests or participate in Western education systems, they often score lower than their peers from individualist cultures. This has been shown in numerous studies across different parts of the world. But when those same individuals are evaluated in their own cultural environments, where intelligence means solving real-world social problems, resolving conflict without confrontation, or maintaining group cohesion, they excel. They often show incredibly high levels of emotional and contextual intelligence. This creates a paradox. If you only measure intelligence through a Western lens, you'll miss whole dimensions of it that are valued elsewhere. In a lot of ways, the tests themselves are biased toward specific kinds of thinking. Analytic, direct, and individual, focused reasoning. But in cultures that prioritize interdependence and social wisdom, intelligence shows up more holistically. It might look quieter, slower, more reflective, and in a system that prioritizes speed and competition, that kind of intelligence gets overlooked. One study by psychologist Richard Nisbett compared how Western and Eastern participants approach reasoning. Americans, he found, were more likely to rely on linear, analytical logic. East Asians were more likely to consider background, context, and relationships between things. They were also more comfortable with contradiction and ambiguity. It's not that one style is better than the other. They just reflect different ways of perceiving the world. Think of it like this: one person uses a magnifying glass, the other a wide-angle lens. Each sees something the other misses. Even simple tasks can reveal how cultural context shapes what we consider intelligent. For example, when asked to group objects like panda, monkey, banana, children from Western cultures often grouped panda and monkey together because they're both animals. That's category-based thinking. Children from collectivist cultures, on the other hand, frequently grouped monkey and banana together because monkeys eat bananas. That's relationship-based thinking. Different logic, different insight. There's also a fascinating study from Zambia where researchers tested local children on a Western-style paper IQ test and on a traditional weaving task, a skill central to their community. The kids who performed poorly on the IQ test often did incredibly well on the weaving task. The takeaway here is powerful intelligence isn't just what you know. It's what your world asks you to know, and when your environment shifts, so does the value of certain types of knowledge and problem solving. These differences aren't just academic, they affect real lives. In Western schools, Students from collectivist backgrounds might come across as passive or unengaged. They're less likely to speak up in class, challenge the teacher, or show off their skills. But that doesn't mean they're not learning. In fact, they may be processing everything deeply and quietly, waiting for the right moment to speak. When they have something meaningful to add, not just to fill space. In collectivist cultures, intelligence is often linked to patience, humility, and timing. There's a deep respect for when to speak, how to respond, and whether saying something will improve the situation. In Western settings, that same behavior can be misread as lack of confidence or competence. But in their home culture, it's considered wisdom. This creates real problems when people from these different systems interact, especially in education and professional settings. Someone who thrives in a relational, reflective environment might struggle in a fast-paced, self-promoting one. Not because they lack ability, but because the cultural rules are different. You could have two people with the same cognitive capacity, but one is praised and the other dismissed purely because of how their intelligence is expressed. So what does this all mean? It means that intelligence is not universal. It doesn't look the same everywhere, and it's definitely not measured the same way. If you define it too narrowly, by speed, verbal skill, test performance, you risk erasing a whole spectrum of human thought and understanding. This paradox doesn't just challenge how we see others. It also challenges how we see ourselves. People who grew up in collectivist cultures but moved to individualist ones often internalize the message that they're less smart, simply because their strengths don't show up the way the system expects. But that's not a flaw, it's a mismatch. Understanding this paradox opens the door to a more flexible, compassionate view of intelligence, one that isn't locked into cultural bias. It reminds us that smart is a moving target, and that sometimes the wisest person in the room isn't the loudest or the quickest. It's the one who knows when not to speak and still understands exactly what's going on. Universal facial expressions versus cultural display rules. All across the world, people smile when they're happy. They frown when they're sad. They show fear with widened eyes and surprise with raised eyebrows. These reactions aren't things we learn. They're things we're born with. That's been proven over and over again in studies going back decades. One of the biggest names in this space is psychologist Paul Ekman. He went from continent to continent, showing people pictures of facial expressions. He even went to isolated tribal communities in Papua New Guinea with no access to media or outside culture. The results were consistent. People could recognize emotions like happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, and disgust just by looking at a face. This became the foundation for the idea of universal facial expressions. These aren't culture-specific gestures. They're biological. They're human. A child in Sweden makes the same face when scared as a child in Kenya or Thailand or Brazil. You don't need a common language to understand fear or joy. Our faces already do the talking. But here's where it starts to twist. Even though we all have the same facial toolbox for showing emotion, different cultures teach us how and when we're supposed to use it. And that part, that's not universal. That's completely cultural. These are what researchers call display rules. Think of them as emotional instructions your culture gives you from a very young age. They're unwritten, but powerful. They shape how we express feelings in public, what's considered respectful, and when certain emotions should be hidden or highlighted. Take anger, for example. In a lot of Western countries, especially the United States, expressing anger can be seen as a sign of honesty or standing up for yourself. It might even be considered necessary in leadership. Someone who speaks their mind and doesn't hide frustration is often viewed as strong or assertive. But in many East Asian cultures, showing anger openly is usually frowned upon. It disrupts group harmony. It embarrasses others. So instead of showing it, people learn to mask it, sometimes with a neutral expression, sometimes even with a polite smile. This doesn't mean they don't feel the anger. It just means the cultural rulebook says, don't show it here. Same goes for grief. In parts of the Middle East and Latin America, public expressions of sadness are expected. Crying loudly, mourning openly, hugging everyone in the room. That's part of the process. It shows respect for the person who passed. But in places like the UK or Finland, emotional restraint is more the norm. Mourning is quiet. Tears might be hidden. Public displays of emotion can make people uncomfortable, even if they understand the grief behind them. This gap between what we feel and what we show creates a kind of double reality. Two people might experience the exact same emotion, but express it in totally different ways, depending on what they've been taught is acceptable. And this can lead to huge misunderstandings, especially in multicultural settings. Let's say someone raised in an emotionally expressive culture joins a workplace where emotional control is the norm. Their enthusiasm might come across as too intense, or their visible frustration might be seen as unprofessional. On the flip side, someone raised in a culture that values emotional restraint might be misread as cold, uninterested, or even rude, when in reality, they're just playing by the emotional rules they were taught. There's also a famous study where Japanese and American participants watched disturbing footage. When they were alone, both groups showed very similar facial reactions: disgust, sadness, shock. But when a researcher was in the room with them, the Japanese participants suppressed those reactions and kept a neutral face, while the Americans continued showing their emotions. The presence of another person changed the rules. It's not about faking. It's about adaptation. In some cultures, showing strong feelings in front of others is a sign of authenticity. In others, it's considered inconsiderate or selfish. You're not just expressing emotion for yourself. You're managing how your emotions affect the people around you. Now imagine what happens when people from different emotional rulebooks start living, working, or building relationships together. A teacher might misread a quiet student as disengaged when they're just being respectful. A partner might think the other person is emotionally distant when they've simply learned not to show vulnerability openly. A manager might prefer enthusiastic candidates and overlook the quieter ones who come from cultures where modesty is a virtue. This doesn't mean one way is right and the other is wrong. It just means emotions are more complicated than we think. They're not just internal feelings. They're social performances too. And depending on where you're from, that performance changes. Even in our digital lives, these rules creep in. Take texting. Some people think a message with no punctuation means someone's mad. Others think it's totally normal. In some cultures, constant exclamation points are warm and friendly. In others, they're unnecessary or even overwhelming. We're applying display rules to written words without even realizing it. So, where does all this leave us? It leaves us with a deeper understanding that just because someone doesn't express emotions the way you expect, doesn't mean they're not feeling them. It means their emotional expression has been shaped by a different set of rules. Learning those rules, being curious about them instead of judging them, is one of the most powerful things we can do in a globally connected world. Because at the end of the day, the emotions are the same: the joy, the fear, the love, the sadness. Our bodies feel them. Our faces are wired to show them. But culture hands us the filter. It teaches us how to show up in the world. And the more we understand those filters, the less likely we are to mistake quiet for coldness, intensity for aggression, or difference for distance. Understanding display rules doesn't erase universal emotion. It just gives it context. And in a world full of faces, learning to read the rules might be the most human skill of all. Cross-cultural variations in the fundamental attribution error. Let's talk about how people explain each other's behavior, and how those explanations change depending on where in the world you were raised. So, there's this thing in psychology called the fundamental attribution error. At its core, it's a bias. When we see someone else doing something, especially something bad, weird, or unexpected, we tend to blame their personality rather than the situation they're in. Like someone cuts you off in traffic. You assume they're a jerk. Not that they might be rushing to the hospital, or late to pick up their kid, or having the worst day of their life. Your brain jumps straight to character. What a rude person. Instead of, maybe something's going on. But when we do the same thing, it flips. If we're the one cutting someone off, we'll say, I didn't see them, or I was stressed, or that road's confusing. We give ourselves situational excuses, but rarely offer that same grace to others. That's the bias. The error: we over-attribute other people's actions to who they are, and under-attribute it to what's happening around them. Now, here's where things get interesting. This so-called universal bias, it's not universal at all. It turns out Western cultures, particularly the US and other individualistic societies, are way more likely to make this error. They lean heavily on internal explanations: personality, motivation, character flaws. It's part of how the culture thinks about people in general. The whole system is built around the idea that people are independent agents, responsible for their own choices. So when someone fails, the assumption is, they didn't work hard enough, they weren't smart enough, they didn't care enough. But in Eastern cultures, places like Japan, China, or Korea, this error doesn't show up the same way. People there are more likely to explain behavior in terms of context, relationships, or environmental factors. If someone's being rude or acting strange, the thought might be, maybe they're under pressure, or maybe there's family stress, or maybe their boss has been hard on them lately. The situation gets just as much, if not more, weight than the person's traits. It's not that people in Eastern cultures never judge others, but they do it through a different lens. They're raised in environments that emphasize interdependence, social harmony, and collective responsibility. That mindset shapes how they interpret behavior. There's a famous study from the 1980s that drove this point home. American and Japanese participants were shown the same social scenarios, like someone yelling at a store clerk, and then asked to explain why the person acted that way. Americans overwhelmingly said things like, "He's aggressive," or "He has a short temper." The Japanese participants were more likely to say things like, "I might have had a bad day," or "Maybe he's under stress at work." They leaned toward situational explanations. The Americans leaned toward dispositional ones. Even in academic settings, this shows up. When American students read essays, they're more likely to assume the author's opinions are their personal beliefs, even if the essay was assigned as part of an exercise. But East Asian students are quicker to consider the possibility that the writer was just fulfilling a role or following instructions. It gets deeper. In collectivist cultures, people are taught from a young age to tune into context. Not just what someone says, but how they say it, who's around them, what the social dynamic is. This habit of context scanning naturally extends into how they interpret actions. The background matters. The invisible stuff matters. In contrast, in individualist cultures, kids are often encouraged to speak their minds, stand out, assert their identity. That creates a more internalized model of human behavior. People are expected to be themselves all the time, so it makes sense that observers assume every action is a reflection of personality. This has real-world consequences. In Western media, for instance, people's downfalls or mistakes are often portrayed as personal failures. They couldn't handle the fame, or they were too impulsive. Rarely does the conversation turn to the pressures of the industry or the systemic conditions that contributed, but in collectivist cultures, the focus might shift more quickly to group dynamics or external pressures. Even justice systems aren't immune. In some countries, sentencing might take into account family situations, economic hardship, or social pressures in a way that's less common in individualist systems, which often emphasize personal accountability over context. And here's where this becomes more than just academic trivia. Imagine people from these two different attribution styles trying to work together, date, or navigate conflict. One person is quick to say, "Why did you do that?" and mean, "What's wrong with you?" The other says, "Why did you do that?" and means, "What was happening around you that led to this?" Same words, completely different meanings. Misunderstandings pile up fast. You can also see this mismatch play out in cross-cultural business settings. A Western manager might see a quiet employee from a collectivist background and think they lack initiative. But that employee might be waiting for consensus or simply respecting hierarchy. The manager blames personality. The truth lies in the situation. So why does any of this matter? Because the more aware we are of these cultural lenses, the more grace we can give others. Not everyone is working from the same blueprint. Some people were taught to look inward for answers. Others were taught to look outward. And both approaches have value. The fundamental attribution error isn't a flaw in your brain. It's a mirror of the world you were raised in. And when we step outside our own reflection, we realize that people aren't always what they seem. Sometimes they're just reacting to forces we don't see. And if we're willing to look for those forces, we can understand people a whole lot better. Bilingual identity switches and personality shifts. Let's say you speak two languages fluently. Ever notice how you feel like a slightly different version of yourself depending on which one you're speaking? Like in one language, you might feel more formal, more polite. In the other, you're more casual, maybe even funnier, or more expressive. It's not just about the words. It's about who you become when you use them. That's not your imagination. That's not you being inconsistent. That's actually a deeply fascinating and well-researched paradox in psychology. It's called the bilingual personality shift or bilingual identity switching. And it's not some niche phenomenon. It's been observed across cultures, age groups, and generations. People who are bilingual don't just translate thoughts from one language to another. They think, feel, and even behave differently depending on the language they're using at the moment. Now, let's unpack why that happens. At first glance, you'd think speaking two languages just gives you access to more words. A bigger dictionary, right? But language doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's soaked in culture, in values, in the way people relate to each other. So when you switch languages, you're also switching cultural codes, and with that, you shift parts of your social identity. Here's a real-world example. A bilingual English, Spanish speaker might feel more assertive and individualistic when speaking English and more community-oriented or emotionally expressive when speaking Spanish. Not because the person is faking it, but because each language activates different cultural frameworks that have been tied to the way that language was learned and used. There's a study from the University of California where bilingual participants were asked to describe themselves in both of their languages. When speaking English, their self-descriptions leaned more toward personal achievements, independence, and uniqueness. But when they switched to Spanish, they focused more on family roles, relationships, and group harmony. Same person, two narratives, just depending on the language. And it's not only about what they say. It's about how they act, how they respond, how they interpret emotions, and even moral decisions. Another study found that bilinguals responded differently to moral dilemmas depending on which language they were using. In their second language, they were more likely to make utilitarian decisions, choosing outcomes that benefited the most people, even if it meant harming one. But when answering in their native tongue, they leaned more toward emotional, intuitive decisions. The theory is that using a second language creates psychological distance. It gives you more emotional detachment, which shifts how you weigh ethical choices. There's even data suggesting bilinguals gesture differently in each language, like hand movements, posture, tone. You might speak Italian with bigger, more animated gestures, but then switch to German and everything tightens up a bit. Because those nonverbal habits, they're part of the language too. And it's not just personality. It can affect memory, mood, even sense of time. Some cultures don't even structure time the same way. Like how some indigenous languages don't talk about the future and past as linearly as English does. So when you speak that language, your whole mental framework about how time flows can shift with it. Kids who grow up bilingual often switch automatically based on context. At school, one personality. At home, another. And they're not being fake. They're being adaptive. They're navigating two sets of social expectations, two sets of emotional norms, two different emotional grammars. And after a while, it doesn't even feel like switching. It feels natural, effortless. Like your brain knows which version of you to pull out for the situation. There's also this emotional connection with language. Most bilinguals will tell you certain feelings just hit harder in one language than the other. Like, you might say, "I love you," in English and feel a certain way, but say it in your mother tongue and it punches deeper. Or insults sting more in the first language. Or a prayer feels more powerful in the language you first learned it in. Because the emotional weight isn't just in the meaning. It's in the memory, the history, the associations your brain has built over time. Some people even report having a language of anger or a language of softness. They'll curse in one and cry in the other. and the brain responds differently too. MRI studies have shown that emotional words spoken in a person's first language light up more parts of the emotional processing centers in the brain. The second language tends to be processed with more cognitive control, more rational detachment. And for immigrants or children of immigrants, this paradox becomes a daily experience, speaking one language with your parents, another with your peers, feeling like you're constantly moving between worlds. In one language, you're a child, respectful, careful, filtered. In the other, you're louder, bolder, maybe even a little rebellious. Same body, same mind. But the voice unlocks different pieces of you. And if you've ever struggled to translate a joke or a phrase and just gave up because it doesn't hit the same, this is why. Languages carry culture. And culture shapes how we see ourselves. Some parts of your personality just don't translate neatly. They belong to a specific you that only shows up in that language. So no, it's not just code switching for the sake of communication. It's identity shifting. Micro-transformation. Not in a fake way, but in a layered, complex, beautifully human way. Being bilingual doesn't just give you more ways to speak. It gives you more ways to be. And if you've ever felt like you're two people in one body, depending on the words coming out of your mouth, you're not crazy. You're just living proof of how deep language goes. It's not just what you say. It's who you are when you say it. Cultural differences in visual perception and optical illusions. Here's something wild to think about. Your eyes might be seeing the same thing as someone else, but your brain could be interpreting it in a completely different way, all because of the culture you grew up in. We like to believe that what we see is what's there. That perception is objective, but it's not. It's a process. It's your brain constantly filling in the blanks, interpreting shapes, guessing depth, organizing shadows, and filtering out stuff it thinks you don't need to worry about. And that process, it doesn't just depend on biology. It's heavily influenced by culture. The world you're raised in literally shapes how you see the world. Let's start with a classic example: optical illusions. Take the mummular liar illusion. You've probably seen it before: two lines, same length, but one has little arrow tails pointing inward, and the other has arrow tails pointing outward. The line with inward tails looks longer, even though they're both exactly the same length. Most people see it and get tricked by it. But not everyone. Psychologists Sagal, Campbell, and Herskovitz ran this test back in the 1960s across different cultures. People from industrialized Western cultures, especially Americans and Europeans, were highly susceptible to the illusion. They consistently thought one line was longer than the other. But people from non-Western rural communities, way less likely to fall for it. Some didn't even see an illusion at all. Why? The explanation lies in something called the carpentered world hypothesis. Basically, people raised in environments full of straight lines, corners, and rectangular architecture, like cities or modern housing, get used to interpreting depth and distance based on those visual cues. So when you see angles like the ones in the mummular liar illusion, your brain unconsciously thinks in terms of perspective. It assumes the lines are part of a three-dimensional scene, like a corner of a room or the edge of a building. But people raised in environments without that kind of architecture, like those who live in circular huts, wide open plains, or densely forested areas, don't make those same assumptions. Their brains haven't learned to associate arrow like angles with depth, so they see the lines more accurately. the illusion doesn't work on them. In other words, the illusion isn't just a trick, it's a cultural artifact. And this kind of variation in perception shows up way beyond just illusions. It shows up in how we look at pictures, how we interpret facial expressions, and even what details we notice first. There's a powerful set of studies done by psychologist Richard Nisbett and his colleagues that illustrates this. They showed participants from East Asian cultures, so like Japan and China and Western cultures, alike the U.S. images of underwater scenes, fish swimming, plants moving, bubbles rising. Then they asked people what they saw. The American participants tended to focus on the biggest, most prominent object, a big fish swimming to the left. Their attention went straight to the focal point, but the East Asian participants were more likely to mention the background. There were some plants, and a few small fish, and the water looked murky. Their focus was broader. They noticed the relationships between objects, not just the objects themselves. That's a deep perceptual difference, not a preference, not a style, a cognitive habit shaped by culture. Western cultures tend to promote analytic thinking, isolate objects, break things down, categorize. Eastern cultures tend to promote holistic thinking, see systems, patterns, relationships, and this has consequences for how people interpret visual scenes, advertisements, even art. For instance, researchers have found that American ads tend to feature a central product, large and clearly visible, often with a clean background. Japanese ads, on the other hand, often show the product in context, surrounded by scenery or being used by a group. Because culturally, people are trained to process visuals differently. One group is drawn to the thing. The other is drawn to the environment around the thing. Another experiment showed participants a photo of a person with a neutral expression, surrounded by other people in the background who were either happy or sad. Western viewers mostly judged the emotion of the central figure on their face alone. East Asian viewers were more likely to be influenced by the expressions of the people in the background. So even reading someone's face, something you'd think is universal, is affected by cultural expectations of context. Then there's how people draw or photograph scenes. Studies have shown that people from individualist cultures tend to place objects more centered in the frame. People from collectivist cultures tend to shift things off center, allowing space for background elements to play a bigger role. Even tracking studies back this up. When shown a busy image, Americans' eyes go straight to the subject and stay there. Chinese participants' eyes dart around more. They scan the whole scene, picking up connections and contextual cues. And none of this means one way is better. It's just different strategies that evolve based on what's prioritized in a culture. If your culture emphasizes independence and personal achievement, it makes sense to zero in on individuals. If your culture emphasizes harmony and interdependence, it makes sense to focus on the big picture. So the next time someone says, "I saw it with my own eyes," just remember, that doesn't make it objective. What you see is filtered through experience, environment, and cultural conditioning. Perception isn't a mirror. It's a lens. And not everyone's lens is shaped the same way. This paradox shows us that reality isn't always about what's there. It's about what your brain is trained to notice. And sometimes the real illusion is thinking we all see the same thing. Honor cultures versus dignity cultures. Let's talk about honor. Not the medieval knights in armor kind. We're talking about honor as a psychological and cultural operating system. and how it radically changes how people respond to conflict, disrespect, or even minor social threats. At first glance, it seems simple. If someone threatens you, you defend yourself, right? But how you defend yourself, verbally, physically, emotionally, actually depends a lot on the kind of cultural system you've been raised in. This is where the paradox between honor cultures and dignity cultures kicks in. In dignity cultures, which are more common in Western, individualistic societies like the US, Canada, or Northern Europe, personal worth is considered inherent. You have dignity just by being a human being. If someone insults you or wrongs you, you're socially expected to stay calm, take the high road, or solve the issue through institutional means, like the legal system or HR at your job. You don't have to prove your value through retaliation because your value is seen as stable. It's not something someone else can take away with words or actions. But in honor cultures, which are found in parts of the Middle East, South Asia, Latin America, and even certain subcultures within the US, like the American South, honor is not something you're automatically given. It's something you earn and protect. Your social standing is fragile, and if someone insults you, even subtly, they're not just hurting your feelings, they're threatening your identity, your family's name, and your reputation. And here's where things get counterintuitive. People raised in honor cultures are often warm, respectful, and extremely generous, as long as they feel respected. But when they feel slighted or disrespected, even in a minor way, the reaction can escalate fast. Not because they're irrational, but because within that framework, failing to defend your honor might mean losing status permanently. Let's bring in some real research to ground this. Psychologists Richard Nisbet and Dov Cohen ran a series of now famous experiments on this. They had college-aged men from the north and south of the United States walk down a hallway. Along the way, they were bumped into by a Confederate Alison Actard, who then insulted them under his breath. Here's what happened. The men from the northern U.S., a region generally more aligned with dignity culture, got annoyed, sure, but mostly shrugged it off. But the southern men, their cortisol and testosterone levels spiked dramatically. They were more likely to confront the person, show aggression, or even act out physically. And get this, they weren't just reacting emotionally. Their entire physiological system responded as if it were under real threat. In the South, honor culture lingers, especially in more rural, traditional areas. And it's not about being hot-headed. It's about rules. Rules that say, if you don't defend yourself, people will see you as weak. If people see you as weak, they'll walk all over you. So people act preemptively, not just to get revenge, but to maintain credibility. Now here's the paradox. In dignity cultures, backing down or walking away from conflict is often praised. It's seen as mature, rational, emotionally intelligent. But in honor cultures, doing the exact same thing, walking away, can be seen as cowardly, humiliating, even shameful. So two people might face the same insult, but react in completely opposite ways, and both think they're doing the right thing. It also plays out differently in how each culture teaches children. In honor cultures, kids are often taught from a young age, don't let people disrespect you. You've got to stand your ground, sometimes even physically, or risk losing face. In dignity cultures, the message is more like, be the bigger person. Use your words. Let the system handle it. This difference shows up in institutions, too. In honor cultures, the justice system is often seen as less reliable for settling personal offenses. Families or communities may take matters into their own hands. This is why you see traditions like blood feuds or vendettas persisting in some parts of the world. They aren't just violent reactions, they're culturally endorsed ways of restoring balance. And if you're thinking, well, dignity cultures are more evolved, hold on a second. Honor cultures also come with deep social cohesion. People look out for each other more. Family loyalty runs high. You insult one person, you're messing with an entire clan. This creates tight, knit networks where generosity, hospitality, and protection are intense and genuine. It's not about ego. It's about collective identity. Plus, honor doesn't always mean aggression. In some cases, it means extreme self-control, dignity in adversity, or quietly upholding family values under pressure. The stakes are just higher. You're not representing yourself, you're representing a lineage. So the real paradox is this: two people can both think they're acting honorably, but their definitions of honor are completely different. One sees calm as strength, the other sees confrontation as necessary, and neither is wrong within their own cultural logic. Now imagine how this plays out globally. In international diplomacy, in business negotiations, even in online arguments. If you're from a dignity culture, and you ignore an insult thinking it's the grown-up thing to do, but the other person is from an honor culture, they might interpret your silence as weakness or surrender. And the whole situation escalates, even though both sides think they're acting reasonably. This isn't just a cultural quirk. It's a deep psychological framework that affects conflict, relationships, pride, forgiveness, and even how people die for causes. Understanding this paradox isn't just interesting. It's essential for surviving in a global world where culture and perception are constantly clashing. So the next time someone reacts in a way that feels extreme or disproportionate to you, pause. It might not be about what was said. It might be about where they're coming from and what they feel they have to protect. Indigenous healing practices and their neurological validations. Let's go way back, not just a few decades, but thousands of years. Before clinical trials, before white coats and prescription pads, before brain scans and peer-reviewed journals, people still healed each other. And they did it with rituals, chants, plants, storytelling, movement, and community. Here's the paradox: for a long time, Western science dismissed indigenous healing as superstition or pseudoscience. But now, neuroscience is beginning to validate what many traditional cultures have known all along, just through a different language. Let's start with something simple: ritual. Ritual is everywhere in indigenous healing, whether it's in a sweat lodge, a drumming circle, an ayahuasca ceremony, or a Navajo chantway. And from the outside, it might look symbolic or even arbitrary. But from the inside, something very real is happening. Researchers have found that rituals regulate the nervous system. The repetition of sounds, movements, and rhythms, especially in a communal setting, can help shift people from sympathetic, fight, or flight, dominance into a parasympathetic, rest and digest, state. This matters because chronic stress, trauma, and emotional overwhelm often trap people in that high alert mode. Rituals help them downshift, and the brain responds. One study from the University of Missouri found that participants involved in group drumming sessions showed reductions in cortisol, the stress hormone, and increased activity in brain regions associated with connection and trust, like the anterior cingulate cortex. Drumming isn't just noise, it's neurological recalibration. Then there's storytelling. which is foundational in many indigenous traditions. In some cultures, healing isn't about extracting symptoms or diagnosing disorders. It's about helping someone make sense of their suffering in a larger story. Western psychology is just catching up to this idea. Narrative therapy, for example, is a modern psychological approach that helps people, or author, their experiences. But indigenous healers have done this forever, guiding people to see pain not as an interruption of life, but as a chapter in a meaningful journey. This shift isn't just emotional. Brain imaging shows that when we reframe our experiences through story, especially in a safe relational setting, the default mode network of the brain becomes more active. That's the part involved in self, reflection, empathy, and understanding others' perspectives. It's the storytelling network. And when it's engaged, trauma loses some of its sharpness. It becomes something we hold, rather than something that holds us. Now let's talk about plant medicine. Take ayahuasca, used for centuries in Amazonian healing ceremonies. For a long time, Western scientists dismissed it as just a hallucinogen. But now, clinical research from institutions like Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London is showing that compounds in ayahuasca, especially DMT and Harmon, can stimulate neuroplasticity, reduce activity in the brain's overactive default mode network, linked with depression and rumination, and help people access emotional memories without the usual fear response. In other words, what a shaman might call soul healing, a neuroscientist might call trauma integration through altered states and neural rewiring. And it's not just about the substance. It's about the setting, the ceremonial context, the preparation, the songs, the guidance. All of it creates a neuropsychological environment that amplifies safety and reduces ego defenses. It's what therapists today call set and setting. But indigenous people understood this long before the phrase was coined. Here's where it gets even more interesting. In many indigenous systems, healing isn't just about the individual, it's about the community. If you're sick, your family, your ancestors, your land, and your relationships are all part of the treatment. That might sound poetic, but it's also neurologically grounded. Social neuroscience shows that relational connection is key to healing. Isolation worsens illness, emotionally and physiologically. But connection, it boosts immune function, reduces inflammation, and increases resilience. Even brain scans show that feeling socially supported lowers activity in regions associated with pain. So when a healer sings over you and the whole community surrounds you with prayer or presence, it's not just symbolic. It's rewiring your sense of safety at a cellular level. There's a famous quote from Lakota medicine man Lame Deer. He said, "You can't wake a person who is pretending to sleep." That line, in a way, describes what Western science is doing now, waking up to truths that have been quietly alive in indigenous practice for generations. Another beautiful example is ceremonial breathwork, found in traditions across the globe, from Hawaiian Ha to Tibetan Tummo to Peruvian techniques. Breathwork is now being studied for its effects on trauma, anxiety, and depression. Deep, conscious breathing shifts SIOL levels, oxygen saturation, and heart rate variability. And that impacts everything from mood to memory to immune function. Indigenous healers didn't need an fMRI to know this. They felt it, and taught it, and passed it down. The paradox here isn't just that science is finally catching up to these practices. It's that it once dismissed them as irrational, only to now find they're often more holistic than modern approaches. Western medicine tends to compartmentalize. This part of your body, that system, this symptom, that treatment. But Indigenous healing sees the whole body, mind, soul, environment, lineage as one interconnected web. Healing one part requires touching the others, and the more we understand about the brain, the more that web looks real. Trauma isn't just a psychological scar, it's stored in the nervous system. It affects digestion, immunity, sleep, relationships. Indigenous systems saw this. They felt this. So now we're in this fascinating moment in history, where neuroscience and tradition are beginning to talk to each other. And the more they talk, the more aligned they seem. That's the paradox. What was once called primitive may actually be ahead of its time. Healing, it turns out, isn't always about technology. Sometimes it's about rhythm, ritual, breath, belonging, and remembering what our ancestors never forgot. Time perception across linear versus cyclical cultural frameworks. Time. It's one of those things we all live by but barely ever think about, until we realize it's not experienced the same way everywhere. In fact, the way we perceive time might be one of the most profound cultural paradoxes out there. Because what if time isn't really ticking forward the same way for everyone? What if, depending on where you grew up, how your ancestors lived, and how your society organizes itself, time actually moves differently? This is where the paradox begins. Linear versus cyclical time frameworks. In most Western cultures, think the US, Germany, or Northern Europe, time is treated as linear. It's a straight arrow, past, present, future, always moving forward. This view shapes everything from how people make decisions to how they feel about aging and productivity. In linear time cultures, people talk about wasting time, saving time, running out of time. Calendars are color-coded. Schedules are packed. Punctuality is a virtue. If a meeting is at 10, it starts at 10, no questions. Time is treated almost like a currency. Once it's gone, you can't get it back. So the goal is to maximize it, spend it wisely, invest it. But then there's the cyclical time worldview. Common in many indigenous cultures, Eastern traditions like Hinduism or Buddhism, and places like parts of Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. In these cultures, time is less of a straight line and more of a loop. Things don't just end, they come back around. Life moves in rhythms, seasons, moon cycles, ancestral lines, rebirth, repetition. And that changes everything. In cyclical cultures, the future isn't always seen as more important than the past. In fact, sometimes it's the past, the wisdom of elders, the patterns of nature, that carries more weight. There's less obsession with what's next and more attention on what's recurring. Things unfold when they're meant to. Deadlines are flexible. Meetings start when everyone's ready. Time isn't something to control. It's something to flow with. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. These different time orientations actually shape perception, behavior, even well-being. Psychological studies have shown that people in linear time cultures tend to experience higher levels of time anxiety. Because if time is always slipping away, there's pressure to do more, be more, achieve faster. There's this ticking feeling in the background, like you're always on a treadmill and the speed's gradually increasing. In contrast, people who align more with cyclical time often report feeling more connected to nature, to ancestors, and to themselves. There's a built-in patience, a comfort with waiting, with returning, with understanding that not everything needs to be rushed to be meaningful. Now, from a neuroscience perspective, here's where it gets wild. Our brains are actually tuned to different time rhythms. There are internal clocks, circadian rhythms, ultradian rhythms, that govern our sleep, energy, mood. And those rhythms don't follow 9 to 5 schedules. They're cyclical by design. So when we try to live our lives in rigid, linear blocks of time, we often end up fighting against our own biology. That's why people often feel more at peace on vacation, in nature, or during cultural ceremonies. Because those environments allow us to drop back into non-linear time. Think about how different it feels to stare at a clock versus sitting by a campfire or ocean. One compresses your awareness, the other expands it. There's a phrase used by the Hopi people of North America, who traditionally live in a cyclical time framework. That roughly translates to, what will be is what has been. It reflects a worldview where time is a spiral, not a straight line. Where history isn't behind us, it's within us. Always circling back, always teaching, always returning. And this cyclical perception doesn't mean people are less motivated or less productive. It just means they experience time with more elasticity. The focus is on harmony, not urgency. But here's the paradox that plays out today. In our increasingly global world, these two frameworks are constantly colliding. A person from a cyclical time culture may be seen as late or reliable in a linear time workplace, even if they're deeply present, committed, and respectful. Meanwhile, someone from a linear time mindset might be seen as cold or rushed in a cyclical culture, focused on deadlines instead of relationships. This creates friction, not because either side is wrong, but because their assumptions about time are completely different. And here's something to sit with: even your sense of self is tied to how you view time. In linear cultures, identity is often future-driven. It's about goals, plans, what you're becoming. In cyclical cultures, identity is more about who you've always been. Your lineage, your traditions, your place in a larger pattern. Neither is better. Both are just ways of making sense of an invisible force that shapes every second of our lives. Even memory behaves differently. In linear time cultures, we organize memories chronologically. First this happened, then that. But in cyclical time frameworks, stories repeat and layer. The same lesson might show up in many different forms over the years. Memory becomes more like a song with verses, rather than a timeline with bullet points. So what's the takeaway? It's not that we should abandon clocks or throw out planners, but maybe there's wisdom in remembering that time is not fixed. It's cultural, it's perceptual, it's deeply human, and it might just be more flexible and more forgiving than we think. Maybe we can learn to live in both worlds, to keep track of schedules without becoming prisoners to them, to chase dreams without forgetting the cycles we're part of, to hold space for deadlines and seasons, for progress and return, for becoming and remembering. Because in the end, time might not be something we move through, but something we dance with. Emotional vocabulary gaps between languages. Language isn't just a tool for communication. It's a map for our emotions. And depending on which map you were handed at birth, you might be able to navigate certain emotional landscapes, or you might not even know they exist. Here's where it gets fascinating and a little mind-bending. Across different languages, there are massive gaps in emotional vocabulary. Some emotions that are deeply familiar in one culture don't even have words in another. And it's not because people in other cultures don't feel those emotions. It's because they haven't been given the words to label them clearly. And when you don't have a word for something, it's harder to notice it, harder to express it, and sometimes harder even to feel it fully. Take, for example, the famous German word, Schadenfreude. It's the experience of taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. There's no direct English equivalent. We can describe it, sure, but we can't sum it up neatly in one word, and that changes how accessible the concept feels in everyday conversation. Or look at amo in Japanese. It's the feeling of pleasurable dependence, like the comfort a child feels leaning into a parent, or even the intimacy between close friends who can rely on each other without shame. In English, we don't really have a clean, positive word for that kind of dependence. Needy sounds negative. Clingy sounds worse. Without the word, the emotional nuance gets flattened or lost. This isn't just about language trivia. It actually reshapes our emotional lives. Psychologists call this emotional granularity. Your ability to name and differentiate between your emotions with precision. Studies, like those from Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern University, show that people with higher emotional granularity, meaning a richer emotional vocabulary, cope with stress better, form healthier relationships, and even have better physical health outcomes. When you can name what you're feeling with more accuracy, you can manage it better. It's the difference between saying, "I feel bad," versus, "I feel frustrated because my boundaries were crossed, but also a little hopeful that I can reset them." More words, more clarity. More clarity, more emotional intelligence. And this is where the cultural paradox hits. If your native language doesn't have certain emotion words, you might struggle to even recognize certain emotional states within yourself. Not because you're defective, but because you literally weren't given the linguistic tools to see them. One famous example, in Tahitian culture, traditional emotional vocabulary historically lacked a word equivalent to sadness, as Westerners understand it. Instead, feelings of sadness were often described with physical terms, like feeling sick or feeling strange. Anthropologist Robert Levy found that without a direct term for sadness, Tahitian speakers conceptualized emotional distress differently, often focusing more on bodily sensations than inner moods. Flip that around, and you'll find that in English, we have dozens of words for anger: irritated, pissed, frustrated, resentful, annoyed, outraged, but comparatively fewer words for complex communal emotions like shared joy or interconnectedness. Other languages fill in those gaps. In Spanish, there's sobremesa, the emotional warmth and lingering after a shared meal, where conversation flows long after the plates are cleared. In Filipino Tagalog, there's jiggle, the uncontrollable urge to pinch something because it's so unbearably cute. In Portuguese, saudade captures a bittersweet longing for something absent, something that might never return. No perfect English equivalents. And because of that, sometimes the richness of those emotional textures feels just out of reach if you're not raised with them. Another mind, bender bilingual people actually report feeling different emotional intensities depending on the language they're speaking. Research from the University of Chicago found that bilingual individuals tend to make more emotionally detached, rational decisions when operating in their second language compared to their native tongue. The emotional charge of words is often weaker in a non-native language. It's not just about vocabulary. It's about how deeply the words are wired into memory, identity, early life experiences. So when someone switches languages, they're not just translating words. They're sometimes switching emotional gears without even realizing it. Here's something else. New words can actually expand our emotional lives. Learning the concept of sautéed might help someone finally describe the bittersweet ache they feel every time they think about a lost childhood home. Learning a me might make someone realize it's okay, healthy even, to crave safe dependence sometimes. Words don't just describe reality, they help create it. But what about cultures that prioritize emotional restraint? In some traditional East Asian societies, there's been less cultural emphasis on verbalizing emotions, especially negative ones. Emotional regulation is often prioritized over emotional expression. In these contexts, not having as many explicit emotion words isn't seen as a deficiency. It's seen as wisdom. Why stir the waters if the goal is peace? That's the final paradox in some cultures. Having fewer emotion words isn't about repression. It's about harmony. And in others, expanding emotional vocabulary is a sign of emotional health. It all depends on what your culture values: self-expression or self-regulation, naming feelings or smoothing them. Neither is better. They just highlight different ways of being human. Maybe the real beauty is that as cultures collide and languages evolve, we're getting access to more emotional tools than ever before. New words, new feelings. New feelings, new ways of connecting. Learning a new emotional word isn't just learning a translation. It's an invitation to notice something in yourself you didn't even know was there. And maybe that's one of the most human things we can do: keep expanding the map of what it means to feel. High context versus low context communication breakdowns. Communication isn't just about what you say. It's also about how much you expect other people to already know without you having to spell it out. And depending on where you grew up, you might be playing completely different games without even realizing it. This brings us into one of the trickiest transcultural paradoxes out there: high context versus low context communication. At first glance, it sounds simple. In high context cultures like Japan, China, many Arab countries, or indigenous communities, a lot of communication happens beneath the surface. The meaning is often in the context, the shared history, the unspoken rules, the reading between the lines. You're expected to pick up on body language, tone shifts, pauses, subtle cues. If you're part of the group, you just know what's being said, even if half of it is never actually verbalized. Meanwhile, in low-context cultures, like the US, Germany, or Scandinavia, communication is much more explicit. People say what they mean what they say. Words are taken at face value. Instructions are detailed. Agreements are spelled out clearly. The burden is on the speaker to communicate fully, not on the listener to figure it out. So far, so good. But when people from these two worlds collide, communication can absolutely fall apart. Picture this: a Japanese manager gives a polite, indirect comment about a project's room for improvement. An American employee hears it as mild encouragement, maybe even a compliment. But in the Japanese context, that gentle suggestion was a serious warning. Because in high-context cultures, what's left unsaid often carries more weight than what's spoken. Or the reverse. An American consultant lays out every potential flaw in a proposal during a meeting with a Korean company. From the consultant's low-context view, they're being thorough and professional. But the Korean executives might interpret the critique as rude, aggressive, even humiliating. Because in high-context cultures, preserving harmony and face is more important than blunt honesty. And here's where the real paradox shows up: neither side is wrong. They're just operating with wildly different assumptions about how meaning gets communicated. Now, where does this come from? Anthropologist Edward T. Hall first introduced the idea of high context and low context cultures back in the 1970s. He suggested that societies with long histories of shared experience, think tight, knit communities, ancient traditions, naturally develop high context communication. There's so much common ground already that it's inefficient to over-explain. You just know. On the other hand, societies with a lot of diversity, immigration, or where individualism is prized, tend to develop low-context styles. Since people don't always share the same background, it's safer and clearer to be explicit. Even basic conversations can feel alien when you're coming from the other side. In a low-context setting, if you want something, you say it. You ask directly. In a high-context setting, making a direct request can feel selfish or confrontational. You're supposed to hint, to gesture, to let the other person offer before you have to ask. Another good example: gift giving. In many high-context cultures, when someone offers you a gift, you're expected to politely decline a few times before finally accepting. It's part of the ritual. But someone from a low-context background might find that confusing or even frustrating. Do you want me to have it or not? The gap between these styles can even impact business deals, diplomatic relations, teamwork, and friendships. There's an interesting study by Aaron Meyer, a professor at INSEAD, who found that when multinational teams come together, miscommunication often doesn't happen because of language barriers, but because of context-level mismatches. Low-context communicators think high-context communicators are being vague or secretive. High-context communicators think low-context communicators are being rude or tactless. Even email habits can reveal these differences. An email from a low-context culture might be packed with bullet points, detailed instructions, clear next steps. Do X, then Y, then Z by Friday. An email from a high-context culture might be more indirect. That would be helpful if we could look into these issues before next week. No direct assignments, no hard deadlines. You're expected to read between the lines, to understand the urgency without it being shouted at you. And if you don't, frustration builds, often quietly, until bigger problems explode. Here's something even more subtle: emotional tone. In low-context communication, clarity is king. Even difficult emotions, anger, disappointment, excitement, are expressed openly. In high-context communication, emotional tone is managed carefully. You might never hear anger expressed directly. You might have to notice it in a small tightening of the jaw, a pause before speaking, a slight formality creeping into their voice. If you're only listening to the words, you'll miss the actual message. And it's not just personal conversations. Legal systems reflect this difference too. In low-context cultures, legal contracts tend to be extremely detailed, trying to cover every possible scenario. In high-context cultures, contracts might be shorter, relying more on trust, relationship, and shared understanding. The paradox is that sometimes more words don't create more clarity, and fewer words don't always mean less meaning. The risk is assuming that your style is normal, and the other is weird. But the truth is, both styles evolved to solve different problems in different environments. Maybe the trick is learning to move between both modes. Sometimes spelling it all out, sometimes trusting that the silence says enough. Knowing when to ask directly and when to listen between the lines. Being able to step into someone else's rhythm, even if it feels unfamiliar at first. Because at the end of the day, communication isn't just about sending a message. It's about making sure it actually lands in whatever language and whatever context it needs to. Cultural variations in resilience, despite similar trauma. Trauma leaves a mark. But the way that mark shapes a person's life isn't just about what happened. It's also about where and how they were taught to heal. This brings us to a strange, humbling paradox in transcultural psychology. Different cultures can experience the same types of trauma, violence, loss, disaster, and yet show wildly different levels of resilience afterward. The event might be similar, but the aftermath looks very different. In Western psychology, resilience is often framed as an individual trait, the ability to bounce back, to push through adversity with internal grit. It's a personal challenge, a hero's journey, basically. But in many other cultures, resilience isn't an individual project at all. It's something collective, something held by a whole community, or even by spiritual practices that weave personal pain into something larger than the self. And depending on which framework you're living inside, your ability to heal after trauma might either be supported or left hanging, without you even knowing why. Take, for example, research comparing Cambodian refugees and Western trauma survivors. Both groups often faced severe trauma, war, genocide, displacement. But studies found that many Cambodian survivors processed their trauma through Buddhist practices of acceptance, karma, and communal ritual. Suffering was framed not just as personal tragedy, but as part of a larger spiritual journey. This didn't erase the pain, but it gave it a context where suffering wasn't random and meaningless. Meanwhile, in Western models, survivors were often left to grapple alone, encouraged to talk it out in therapy sessions that focused heavily on revisiting the trauma itself. Neither method is universally right or wrong, but the frameworks shape very different recovery paths. Another example, after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, studies of survivors in Sri Lanka found that strong community ties, religious coping, and traditional healing rituals played a major role in emotional recovery. People leaned into communal mourning ceremonies, public rituals of remembrance, and collective rebuilding efforts. Contrast that with post-trauma responses in more individualistic societies, where personal therapy sessions and private coping were often emphasized instead of collective healing. And it shows up even at the biological level. Research has found that social connectedness, having strong, trusted bonds with others, is one of the biggest predictors of lower cortisol levels after trauma. In cultures where community is prioritized over individual autonomy, that social web often kicks in automatically after tragedy. Meals get shared. People show up at each other's doors. Grief isn't something you do alone in a room. It spills out into the streets, into public ceremonies, into song and ritual. In more individualistic settings, that web can be thinner. People might feel isolated not because they have no friends, but because the cultural script tells them they're supposed to handle it themselves. That's the paradox. Some cultures build resilience into the fabric of daily life without labeling it therapy at all. Here's another layer. The narrative we tell about trauma matters too. In many indigenous cultures, trauma is often woven into a narrative of survival and continuation. The pain doesn't define the individual. It connects them to generations of ancestors who also endured. It's part of a bigger story, but in modern Western frameworks, trauma can sometimes become a defining feature of identity. You are a trauma survivor. You carry this label forward. And while that can be empowering in some cases, it can also accidentally freeze people inside the trauma story, making it harder to imagine a future beyond it. In some African cultures, there's a concept called Ubuntu, the idea that I am because we are. After collective trauma, the focus isn't on how are you coping, but how are we healing together? The wound is shared, and so is the recovery. Psychologist Michael Ungar has written about this, arguing that resilience is highly contextual. It's not just about inner strength, it's about having access to the kinds of resources, social, cultural, physical, that your particular environment values and provides. In one culture, resilience might mean being able to stand up and speak your truth loudly. In another, it might mean being able to carry your pain quietly, gracefully, without burdening others. Both are valid. Both require incredible strength. But they look nothing alike from the outside. There's also the role of belief systems. Some cultures normalize suffering. In certain Buddhist teachings, suffering isn't a personal failure. It's a basic part of life. Everyone suffers. It's not your fault. You're not broken. That kind of worldview can soften the blow of trauma in a way that pure clinical language sometimes can't. Meanwhile, in cultures obsessed with control, where people are taught that if you plan well enough, work hard enough, live perfectly enough, you can avoid bad things, the experience of trauma can hit even harder. Not just because of the event itself, but because of the shattering of that illusion. This wasn't supposed to happen to me. And then there's storytelling. In cultures with strong oral traditions, survivors often tell their stories publicly, over and over, embedding their pain into a communal history. In modern clinical settings, trauma is sometimes processed privately, with great care around confidentiality and personal boundaries. Again, neither approach is universally better, but they create very different emotional landscapes after trauma. The final paradox. Resilience isn't some magical trait certain individuals are born with. It's often about whether your culture hands you the tools, community, meaning, rituals, shared language, that make healing possible. In some places, you don't even have to ask for help. The help just shows up, baked into the social fabric. In others, you might have all the freedom in the world, but you have to figure out healing alone. Maybe resilience isn't just about strength. Maybe it's about not having to be strong by yourself. Shame versus guilt, cultural orientations, and mental health outcomes. Different cultures build very different emotional landscapes, and two of the most powerful emotions that shape human behavior, shame and guilt, don't show up equally across the world. In some cultures, shame is the main social regulator. In others, guilt takes that role. These emotional orientations don't just impact how people behave after mistakes. They also deeply influence mental health, self-esteem, and how people experience belonging. Shame and guilt both arise when someone violates a social expectation, but they aren't the same experience. Shame is the feeling that, I am bad. It attacks the whole self. Guilt is the feeling that, I did something bad. It targets behavior, not identity. In many Eastern, African, Middle Eastern, and Indigenous cultures, shame is a dominant emotional framework. Social harmony is valued above individual expression. When someone breaks a rule, the emotional weight falls not just on them individually, but on the way their behavior reflects on their family, their community, their ancestors. The fear isn't just about personal failure. It's about dishonoring the group. In contrast, many Western, particularly Anglo-American, cultures are more guilt-oriented. Individuals are seen as separate units. If you mess up, it's between you and your conscience. The focus is on internal responsibility rather than external judgment. This difference shapes how people experience mental health struggles. In shame-based cultures, people might feel intense pressure to hide problems like depression, anxiety, or trauma because acknowledging these struggles could be seen as bringing dishonor to their group. Mental health becomes not just a personal struggle, but a potential source of public shame. In guilt-based cultures, people might be more willing to admit internal struggles because the mistake or flaw is framed as something separate from their core worth as a person. Therapy models built around guilt assume that by addressing behavior and making amends, healing can occur. There's clinical research backing this up. Studies show that chronic shame, the belief that one's entire self is defective, is strongly linked to depression, suicidal ideation, and post-traumatic stress disorder across cultures. Guilt, when healthy, is often associated with adaptive coping, like taking responsibility, making changes, and seeking reconciliation. But it's not as simple as saying guilt is good and shame is bad. In cultures where shame is woven into the moral fabric, it serves an important role. It keeps people connected to the collective. It reminds individuals that their actions ripple outward. In these cultures, a sense of shame after wrongdoing can motivate repair, reconciliation, and communal healing. When shame becomes toxic, though, when it's internalized as a permanent mark on the self, it can silence people. Instead of seeking help after failure or suffering, people might withdraw, deny, or hide their pain. The fear isn't just about consequences. It's about identity destruction. In cultures that emphasize guilt, the risk is different. People can become over-focused on personal responsibility, even in situations where larger systemic forces are at play. Someone might blame themselves for being poor, for getting sick, for being a victim of injustice, because the culture teaches them that their destiny is entirely their own making. This can create a different kind of emotional isolation. One study on Japanese versus American students revealed this stark difference. Japanese students, coming from a more shame-oriented culture, tended to internalize failure as a reflection on their social worth. American students were more likely to frame failure as a challenge to overcome individually. When offered support, Japanese students sometimes hesitated to accept it, fearing it would spotlight their inadequacy. American students were more likely to seek help proactively, viewing it as part of personal growth. Family dynamics also show this contrast. In many shame-oriented cultures, family honor is a living, breathing thing. Achievements bring glory not just to the individual, but to the entire lineage. Failures or scandals can stain the family's reputation for generations. The emotional cost of failure isn't just private sadness. It's a social wound. In guilt-oriented families, mistakes are often handled more privately. An individual might be encouraged to apologize, make amends, and move forward without believing they've permanently damaged their family's standing. Mental health outcomes reflect these frameworks. In high shame cultures, mental illness stigma tends to be stronger. Seeking therapy might be viewed as admitting permanent brokenness. People suffering from depression or anxiety might be encouraged to save face, rather than speak openly about their struggles. In high guilt cultures, mental health struggles are often framed as challenges to be worked through. Therapy is seen more as a tool for self-improvement than a symbol of failure. There's a neurological layer here too. Research using brain imaging has shown that shame activates parts of the brain associated with threat perception and self-referential processing. Guilt, especially when handled adaptively, activates areas related to moral reasoning and behavioral adjustment. These biological patterns mirror the emotional experiences. Shame feels like an attack. Guilt feels like a guide, but resilience can exist in both systems. In shame-based cultures that also have strong rituals for forgiveness and restoration, like public apologies, community healing ceremonies, and religious absolution practices, the damage of shame can be repaired collectively. In guilt-based cultures that emphasize self-compassion and growth after failure, guilt can drive personal evolution without destroying self-worth. Where things go wrong is when shame is weaponized. When people are frozen in permanent exile, unable to find a path back to belonging, or when guilt is twisted into chronic self-blame, leaving people paralyzed by perfectionism and isolation. The paradox is that neither emotion is universally harmful or universally healthy. Their impact depends on the broader cultural story about what it means to mess up and what it means to come back from it. Healing after mistakes, in the end, depends on whether the culture offers a road back to connection. Some cultures hand you a map. Others leave you wandering alone. Attachment theory variations across cultural child-rearing practices. Attachment theory started with a simple but powerful idea that the way a child bonds with their caregiver shapes how they relate to others for the rest of their life. The original research by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth focused mostly on Western, middle-class families. Over time, that created a kind of invisible assumption that the patterns they found were universal. But as studies expanded across cultures, cracks started to show. The truth is, attachment styles are not one size fits all. The way a child forms emotional bonds can look very different depending on the cultural expectations around independence, community, emotion, and caregiving itself. In many Western societies, particularly in places like the US, Canada, and parts of Europe, the ideal has been the secure attachment child, the one who explores independently but uses the parent as a safe base. Emotional expressiveness is encouraged. Seeking help is seen as healthy. Autonomy and self-confidence are the ultimate goals. But in collectivist cultures, like Japan, China, and much of Latin America, the goal isn't necessarily individual exploration. It's relational harmony. In Japan, for instance, parents often anticipate a child's needs so quickly and so sensitively that overt attachment behaviors, like crying out or reaching for the parent, happen less often. Independence is not emphasized in the early years. Emotional closeness, dependency, and interdependence are considered signs of a healthy relationship, not a developmental problem. Cross-cultural attachment studies, like the famous Strange Situation, experiments replicated across different countries, reveal some of these differences. In Germany, a culture that values independence from a very young age, infants are more likely to show what Ainsworth called avoidant attachment behaviors, appearing distant or self-reliant even when stressed. But in that cultural context, this isn't necessarily a sign of emotional damage. It's seen as a success. The child is learning early to be strong and self-sufficient. In contrast, studies among the Gusii people of Kenya showed that babies are rarely left alone at all. Infants are carried nearly all the time, either by their mothers or by siblings and extended family. Crying is quickly responded to, and independence isn't a developmental goal during infancy. Attachment looks more like constant physical closeness than brief separations and reunions. Even the way distress is expressed and managed varies. In Western settings, a child crying at daycare drop-off is often seen as a normal part of separation anxiety, a sign that the child is securely attached, but adjusting to the absence. In cultures where early separation is rare or frowned upon, such distress might be interpreted as a serious problem requiring immediate correction, not as something to be weathered through. Attachment theory's original framework categorizes children into secure, avoidant, resistant, ambivalent, or disorganized attachment styles. But these categories are heavily shaped by Western ideals. In cultures where direct emotional expression is discouraged, a child's quietness or apparent emotional reserve might be misclassified as avoidant, when in reality, it's a culturally appropriate way of showing respect or emotional regulation. One study looking at attachment in Israeli kibbutzim, communal living arrangements where children often slept separately from parents and were cared for collectively, found that children formed strong, secure attachments not necessarily to their biological parents alone, but to a wider circle of consistent caregivers. The model of one primary attachment figure wasn't as rigid. Emotional security was built through community reliability, not singular parental focus. Attachment is also shaped by broader cultural beliefs about dependency and maturity. In cultures that idealize early independence, a toddler tying their own shoes or handling conflicts without adult intervention is praised. In cultures that value interdependence, a toddler seeking adult help for small tasks is not seen as less capable. It's seen as building relational trust and social belonging. Neuroscience research shows that close physical contact, responsive caregiving, and emotional attunement all help regulate a baby's nervous system, regardless of cultural style. But what counts as responsive can look dramatically different across contexts. In Western psychology, responsiveness often means verbal affirmation, talking through feelings, explaining events, offering choices. In other cultures, responsiveness is nonverbal. A touch, a shared look, an unspoken understanding. Silence can be nurturing, not neglectful. These variations create challenges when trying to apply attachment frameworks across the globe. Well, meaning Western psychologists sometimes pathologize behaviors that are perfectly healthy in another context. A quiet, reserved child in Korea might be labeled insecurely attached based on Western standards, but is actually thriving within their culture's relational expectations. Mental health outcomes later in life also reflect these early attachment differences. In cultures that value collective responsibility, adults might be less prone to individualistic anxieties about self-worth because identity is rooted in the group. In cultures that prize personal achievement, adults might face higher pressures around success, self-esteem, and romantic relationship performance, all traced back to early models of autonomy and self-sufficiency. The core need behind attachment, feeling safe, seen, and soothed, is universal. But the paths cultures take to meet that need vary. Some emphasize independence early, trusting that strong individuals will form strong societies. Some emphasize relational closeness early, trusting that strong relationships will form strong individuals. Neither path is objectively better. Both are adaptive responses to larger social realities. Economic structures, historical experiences, philosophical beliefs about what it means to be human. Understanding attachment through a multicultural lens challenges the idea that there's only one healthy way to raise a child. It opens the door to honoring different strategies for building trust, security, and emotional strength from the very first years of life. What matters most isn't whether a child fits a Western checklist of secure attachment behaviors. It's whether they are growing up knowing, deep in their nervous systems, that they are not alone in the world, that someone is attuned to them, cares for them, and believes they belong. The expressions change, the need never does. Cultural differences in pain expression and threshold. Pain is a universal human experience, but the way people express pain, and even the way they feel it, is shaped dramatically by the culture they grow up in. It's not just about personal tolerance. It's about what emotions are allowed to be visible, what suffering means, and how communities react to it. In Western biomedical models, pain is often treated as a purely biological response. An injury leads to nerve activation, which leads to pain perception. But cross-cultural research shows that pain is just as much a social and emotional experience as it is a physical one. One major difference across cultures is how acceptable it is to outwardly express pain. In many Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Latin American, and African cultures, expressing pain openly is normal and even expected. A person might moan, cry, or show visible distress during medical procedures or injuries. Expressing suffering is understood as an important way to seek support, signal need, and involve the community in healing. In contrast, in many Northern European, East Asian, and Anglo-American cultures, stoicism in the face of pain is valued. People are encouraged to suppress outward expressions of suffering. Showing pain can be seen as a weakness, a loss of control, or even an inconvenience to others. This isn't about who feels pain more intensely. It's about different cultural scripts for what to do with that pain. One cross-cultural study found that Italian and Hispanic patients reported higher pain scores than Anglo-American patients under identical medical conditions. But when physiological markers like heart rate and cortisol were measured, there weren't significant differences. The bodies were responding similarly, but the willingness to report and display pain varied depending on cultural norms. Another layer to this is the idea of pain threshold versus pain tolerance. Pain threshold is the point at which a stimulus becomes painful. Pain tolerance is how much pain a person can endure before it becomes unbearable. Both are influenced by genetics to some extent, but culture heavily shapes the psychological and social context around them. For example, in cultures that associate stoicism with strength, individuals might mentally frame pain differently, which can actually alter their subjective experience of it. If someone believes enduring pain is a moral or social virtue, their brain processes pain signals with less emotional distress. Neuroscientific studies using brain imaging have shown that cultural beliefs can modulate how pain is processed in the brain. In particular, cultural differences in emotional regulation strategies, such as acceptance versus suppression, can change how the brain responds to painful stimuli. In Japan, for instance, cultural norms often promote endurance and self-restraint. Patients might downplay symptoms to avoid burdening others or disrupting group harmony. In contrast, in many Middle Eastern cultures, being vocal about pain is part of a communal coping process, inviting empathy, caregiving, and collective emotional release. Pain expression is also tied to gender roles, which vary across cultures. In some societies, men are expected to endure pain silently while women are allowed, or even expected, to express distress openly. In others, gender roles around pain are reversed or less rigid. These expectations shape how individuals internalize their own experiences. A man who cries out during pain in a stoic culture might experience shame or guilt beyond the physical suffering itself, amplifying the psychological burden. Religious and spiritual beliefs play a role too. In some Catholic and Orthodox Christian cultures, pain can be framed as redemptive, linked to ideas of sacrifice, penance, and moral purification. In Buddhist cultures, pain may be seen as part of life's natural suffering, something to observe without clinging or aversion. These frameworks don't just philosophically color the pain experience. They actively change how individuals interpret and tolerate it. Medical treatment is also impacted. Healthcare providers from cultures that expect stoicism might underestimate the pain levels of expressive patients, dismissing them as exaggerating. Conversely, providers might miss the severity of symptoms in patients who minimize their pain, believing that if the patient isn't complaining, everything must be fine. This cultural gap in pain communication can lead to serious disparities in diagnosis and treatment. Research has shown that ethnic minority patients often receive less pain medication than white patients in Western healthcare systems, partly because of misinterpretations of pain behaviors. Children learn these cultural scripts early. Studies on young children in different cultural contexts reveal that even at preschool age, children adjust their pain expressions to match the norms they've absorbed. A child growing up in a culture that values emotional restraint will quickly learn to bite their lip and soldier on after a fall. A child in a culture that validates open expression might cry out loudly and immediately seek comfort without internalizing shame. There's also a communal aspect to how pain is interpreted. In many indigenous cultures, pain is not seen as an individual burden but a shared experience. Community rituals, group healing practices, and collective caregiving are central to how suffering is processed. Pain is woven into the fabric of community life, and individual pain is everyone's concern. In modern Western societies, pain is often privatized. It's treated behind closed doors, discussed in hushed tones, managed with pharmaceuticals. The emotional isolation of pain can intensify its psychological impact, sometimes leading to higher rates of depression among people with chronic pain. The paradox is that pain is both deeply private and profoundly social. Culture shapes not just how pain is seen from the outside, but how it is felt from the inside. The body's sensory mechanisms might be similar across the human species, but the mind's interpretation of pain, whether it's seen as a tragedy, a test, a burden, a badge of honor, or a spiritual lesson, depends heavily on the culture surrounding the individual. In the end, understanding pain across cultures isn't just about medical empathy. It's about recognizing that even the most intimate sensations are shaped by stories we inherit, expectations we absorb, and communities we belong to. Pain doesn't just live in the nerves. It lives in the meaning we give it. Social harmony versus truth-seeking communication. Styles across cultures. Communication is never just about the exchange of information. It's about managing relationships, protecting identities, and navigating invisible social rules. One of the deepest divides between cultures lies in how they prioritize social harmony versus truth-seeking when people speak to each other. In societies where social harmony is valued, like Japan, Korea, much of Southeast Asia, and parts of Latin America, the main goal of communication is to preserve relationships, avoid confrontation, and maintain group cohesion. Truth, in these contexts, isn't abandoned. It's just often delivered carefully, softened, or delayed to protect feelings and status. In cultures that prioritize truth-seeking, like Germany, the Netherlands, Israel, and the United States. The communication ideal is directness. Being honest is seen as a form of respect. It signals transparency, trustworthiness, and individual responsibility. Sugarcoating, avoiding, or filtering the truth might be viewed as deceitful or even disrespectful. The consequences of these differing styles ripple into almost every interaction, from family conversations to international business negotiations. Take conflict, for instance. In harmony-focused cultures, conflict is seen as dangerous because it can rupture the social fabric. When disagreements arise, people often use indirect language, euphemisms, nonverbal cues, or silence to signal disapproval or disagreement. Saving face, both your own and the other person's, is a moral responsibility. The goal is not necessarily to win an argument, but to maintain the relationship. In truth-seeking cultures, conflict is seen as an opportunity for clarification, improvement, and even intimacy. Speaking directly about problems is believed to strengthen trust, not weaken it. Disagreements are expected to be aired openly, sometimes even forcefully, under the belief that honesty leads to better outcomes for everyone. The cultural anthropologist Edward T. Hall described this in his theory of high context and low context communication. In high context societies, where social harmony matters, much of the communication relies on unspoken understandings, shared assumptions, and implicit messages. Words are carefully chosen, and nonverbal signals carry much of the real meaning. In low-context societies, where truth-seeking is emphasized, communication is explicit. People expect words to carry the full meaning. If something isn't said, it's assumed it doesn't exist. Clarity, precision, and verbal transparency are critical. This leads to vastly different interpretations of politeness. In harmony-oriented cultures, being polite often means avoiding directness. Saying maybe instead of no is considered polite and mature. Softening criticisms with apologies or vague language is not dishonest. It's respectful. In truth-seeking cultures, politeness means being clear and forthright. If a friend asks if their presentation was good, and it wasn't, the honest feedback is viewed as a favor, not an insult. Holding back the truth would be seen as patronizing. There's also a profound difference in how people offer opinions or advice. In harmony-seeking environments, advice might be wrapped in storytelling, metaphors, or gentle nudges rather than clear directives. The goal is to allow the other person to save face and arrive at the conclusion themselves. In truth-focused environments, giving straightforward advice is seen as a duty to the other person's success, even if it stings temporarily. Research backs up these differences. A 2015 study in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology found that American participants rated direct negative feedback as more helpful and trustworthy than indirect feedback, while Japanese participants rated indirect feedback as more respectful and considerate. Both groups were processing the same feedback, but cultural lenses dramatically shifted what they valued about the communication. Even apologies work differently across these styles. In harmony-driven cultures, apologies are often given to smooth over situations, even when no one is personally at fault. It's a way of restoring balance and signaling that the relationship matters more than the individual incident. In truth-driven cultures, apologies tend to focus on personal responsibility, admitting fault and seeking forgiveness for a specific action. Neither approach is inherently better or worse. Truth-seeking communication can foster innovation, clarity, and rapid problem-solving. It can also cause unnecessary conflict, bruise egos, and erode relationships if not handled sensitively. Harmony-seeking communication can build deep loyalty, trust, and emotional safety. But it can also delay necessary change, suppress important disagreements, and create confusion when problems go unaddressed. In life or death situations, like emergency rooms or military operations, cultures often temporarily shift toward direct communication because clarity is non-negotiable. In delicate interpersonal matters, like family disputes or diplomatic negotiations, cultures may lean toward more harmony, preserving strategies to avoid escalation. Individual personalities also interact with these cultural norms. Not every person in a harmony-focused society avoids conflict, and not every person in a truth-focused society embraces bluntness. But cultural patterns create strong currents that shape how individuals are expected to behave, and how their behavior is interpreted. Misunderstandings easily happen when these styles collide. Someone from a truth-seeking background might view a harmony-seeker as evasive or untrustworthy. Someone from a harmony-focused background might view a truth-seeker as rude or insensitive. Both may walk away from the same conversation feeling frustrated and judged, without realizing that they were operating by different communication rules. Becoming aware of these dynamics changes everything. It allows us to slow down, listen more carefully, and recognize that a different style doesn't mean a bad intention. It also gives us the flexibility to adapt, to know when to prioritize harmony and when to prioritize truth depending on the relationship, the stakes, and the cultural context. At its best, communication isn't just about exchanging facts. It's about building bridges. Some bridges are built with bricks of truth. Others are woven with threads of grace. Both can be strong. Both are needed. Paradoxical effects of meditation across contemplative versus action-oriented cultures. Meditation is widely considered one of the most effective tools for improving mental health, reducing stress, and enhancing overall well-being. But when we take a closer look at its effects, especially across different cultural contexts, a paradox emerges. Meditation isn't universally beneficial in the same way for everyone. The reason: cultures themselves play a crucial role in how meditation is experienced, understood, and integrated into daily life. Specifically, the divide between contemplative cultures and action-oriented cultures reveals stark differences in the way meditation impacts people. In contemplative cultures, like many found in Eastern traditions, meditation is central to life. It's often practiced for the sake of spiritual growth, self-awareness, and emotional balance. People from these cultures are generally accustomed to slowing down, reflecting, and fostering inner peace. For them, meditation aligns seamlessly with their broader cultural values of introspection, non-attachment, and mindfulness. In contrast, action-oriented cultures, particularly in the West, are more focused on achievement, productivity, and outward success. In these cultures, meditation is often seen as a tool to improve performance, reduce stress, or solve specific problems, rather than a pathway to deeper spiritual insight. But this difference creates a paradox. In contemplative cultures, meditation isn't just a technique to manage stress, it's a way of life, a foundation for mental and spiritual well-being. However, in action-oriented cultures, meditation may not always deliver its full potential because it's approached with a goal-oriented mindset, leading to different tasks and sometimes conflicting outcomes. Meditation in contemplative cultures is often seen as an end in itself. People meditate for the sake of meditation, not necessarily to fix something, but to explore the self, attain enlightenment, or simply experience the present moment more fully. This cultural perspective aligns with practices found in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, where meditation is woven into the fabric of daily life. In these cultures, slowing down isn't seen as a sign of weakness or inefficiency. It's understood as a vital part of human existence. The benefits of meditation in these cultures tend to be more holistic and intrinsic. For example, in Japan, where Zen meditation is prevalent, the practice often becomes a deeply integrated ritual. Over time, it promotes awareness, mindfulness, and emotional regulation, fostering a state of calm that permeates daily life. The intention isn't to achieve any specific external result, but rather to cultivate a deeper connection to the present moment, enhance inner peace, and promote a sense of balance. When meditation is practiced in a contemplative way, without the expectation of immediate results or performance metrics, individuals experience a profound sense of calm and perspective. Meditation becomes less about fixing something and more about accepting things as they are, including discomfort, frustration, and emotional turbulence. This acceptance forms the foundation of true mental resilience. In contrast, in action-oriented cultures, meditation often comes with a different agenda. Here, the focus tends to be on quick fixes, productivity, and self-improvement. People in these cultures are used to doing rather than being, and this mindset can influence how meditation is practiced. Meditation becomes something you do to get ahead, manage stress, or improve performance, not something you do just for the sake of being present. For example, in the United States, mindfulness and meditation have been marketed primarily as tools to reduce stress and improve cognitive performance. People in action-oriented cultures may approach meditation as a strategy to achieve mental clarity, manage anxiety, or improve concentration in order to excel in their careers or personal lives. However, this goal-oriented mindset can lead to paradoxical effects. Instead of experiencing peace and clarity, some individuals may feel frustrated by meditation because they approach it with expectations. They want to feel better instantly, achieve mental calm quickly, or clear their minds of all thoughts. But meditation, especially when practiced as a purely goal-oriented activity, often resists such efforts. The harder one tries to control their thoughts or achieve success in meditation, the more they may struggle with it. This difference in mindset between contemplative and action-oriented approaches leads to a paradox. In contemplative cultures, meditation is approached with patience and a sense of non-attachment. There's no rush, no pressure to achieve specific results. As a result, people often experience deeper, more lasting benefits, improved emotional regulation, greater empathy, and a profound sense of peace. In action-oriented cultures, the same meditation techniques can lead to frustration, anxiety, or a sense of failure because the practice doesn't fit neatly into a framework of immediate improvement or measurable success. When meditation is treated like any other performance-based activity, its benefits may not be as easily attained. People might feel that they're failing at meditation because they're unable to clear their minds, focus completely, or achieve a state of calm within the time they've allotted. This can actually heighten stress rather than alleviate it. The paradox becomes even more evident when considering the cultural pressures of performance. In action-oriented societies, the drive for success often leads to a mindset that equates productivity with self-worth. People feel pressured to be constantly on the move, always achieving and doing. So, when they approach meditation with the expectation that it will make them more productive or fix a problem, they find themselves doubly stressed. Stressed about their daily responsibilities and stressed about not doing meditation right. This performance-oriented mindset can also lead to self-criticism. The more someone from an action-oriented culture tries to meditate to perform better or feel less stressed, the more they may experience frustration when they inevitably fail to meet their expectations. This can spiral into feelings of inadequacy, which undermines the very benefits of meditation. Instead of being a tool for relaxation and peace, meditation becomes just another task to master. So how do we resolve this paradox? The key is in reframing the approach to meditation, regardless of cultural background. Meditation isn't about striving for perfection or meeting external goals. It's about being present with what is. In cultures that prioritize action, it's important to emphasize the non-doing nature of meditation, encouraging people to let go of expectations and embrace meditation as a moment-to-moment experience, not something to achieve, can reduce the performance pressure. One way to bridge this cultural divide is to integrate both approaches. In contemplative cultures, individuals can be reminded that meditation can still be a powerful tool for self-improvement, even if it's not immediately measurable. In action-oriented cultures, meditation can be reframed as a practice of simply being, not performing, and thus helping to alleviate the stress that comes from trying to achieve in every aspect of life. By understanding and embracing both perspectives, people can truly harness the full potential of meditation, regardless of where they come from. The paradox of meditation across contemplative vs. action-oriented cultures isn't a contradiction, but an opportunity to integrate mindfulness into daily life in a way that respects the unique cultural contexts in which it's practiced. Cultural intelligence versus academic intelligence discrepancies. Cultural intelligence and academic intelligence are two crucial, yet distinct, aspects of human capability, and the way they interact can reveal a fascinating paradox. Academic intelligence, commonly measured through standardized tests and academic achievements, reflects one's ability to analyze, reason, and think critically. In contrast, cultural intelligence is the ability to understand, adapt, and work effectively in different cultural contexts, navigating social situations and responding to the values, norms, and behaviors of diverse groups. The paradox arises when these two types of intelligence don't align in the expected way. Academic intelligence is often highly valued in most societies, being the standard for measuring intellectual success. However, cultural intelligence tends to operate more subtly and is harder to quantify. Yet, in many real-world scenarios, cultural intelligence often proves more essential than academic intelligence, especially in today's globalized world. To understand the paradox, let's explore how educational systems vary across cultures. Western education, particularly in the United States and Europe, often emphasizes individual achievement, critical thinking, and standardized testing. Academic intelligence is measured through IQ tests, grades, and structured problem solving. The approach values logic reasoning and the ability to solve abstract problems independently. Eastern educational systems, like those in Japan or China, tend to focus more on collective learning, respect for authority, and interpersonal harmony. Academic achievement is still important, but there's a greater emphasis on learning within a group setting and understanding social dynamics. This type of learning is more in tune with cultural intelligence. It's about adapting to social environments, showing empathy, and understanding the unspoken rules of interaction. Here lies the paradox. Someone with high academic intelligence might struggle in cross-cultural settings because they're focused on structure, logic, and individual achievement. Meanwhile, someone with high cultural intelligence might not excel in standardized academic tests, but could thrive in multicultural environments, understanding and adapting to different social situations and communication styles. Imagine a highly educated professional from the West working in an Eastern country. Despite having impressive academic qualifications, they may struggle to adapt to the cultural norms of indirect communication, humility, and respect for hierarchy. Their direct communication style, often valued in Western cultures, might lead to misunderstandings or create friction in more collectivist cultures. On the other hand, someone with high cultural intelligence, even without the same academic credentials, could excel in such situations. They understand the importance of relationship building in direct communication and the cultural value of humility. Their ability to adapt and work harmoniously in diverse environments allows them to thrive, even when academic intelligence is less critical. The paradox continues as the world becomes increasingly globalized. As businesses, governments, and organizations expand across borders, cultural intelligence becomes more essential. It's not enough to rely solely on academic intelligence in today's interconnected world. In international business, diplomacy, or multicultural teams, success depends on understanding and respecting cultural differences, establishing trust, and communicating effectively across diverse backgrounds. Despite this, academic intelligence often takes precedence. In most educational systems, particularly in Western societies, achievements like degrees, test scores, and personal accomplishments are celebrated as the ultimate markers of success. Cultural intelligence, by comparison, is harder to measure and often undervalued. As a result, people with strong academic credentials may find it difficult to adapt to international or cross-cultural environments, while those with high cultural intelligence may not be recognized for their ability to navigate complex social dynamics. Consider the increasing emphasis on intercultural competence in the workplace. Companies today are looking for employees who can work across cultures, whether it's managing diverse teams or engaging with international clients. While academic intelligence helps individuals excel in technical and problem-solving tasks, cultural intelligence is crucial when it comes to building relationships, navigating social norms, and understanding diverse perspectives. The problem arises because traditional education systems, focused on academic intelligence, often fail to equip individuals with the necessary skills to succeed in globalized, multicultural settings. This mismatch can leave highly academically intelligent individuals struggling to adapt to the real-world dynamics of intercultural communication, collaboration, and leadership. To resolve this paradox, there is growing recognition of the need to integrate both academic and cultural intelligence. Educational institutions can offer cross-cultural training, promote language learning, and encourage study abroad programs to help students develop both cognitive and social skills. By encouraging a more holistic approach to learning, we can better prepare individuals to excel not only in academic environments, but also in multicultural, real-world scenarios. In conclusion, both academic intelligence and cultural intelligence are critical, but they serve different purposes. Academic intelligence helps individuals excel in structured, knowledge-based tasks, while cultural intelligence enables people to navigate the complexities of social environments and diverse cultures. The paradox is not that one is more important than the other, but that they often don't align in the way we expect. As the world continues to globalize, the ability to balance both forms of intelligence will be key to success. By integrating cultural intelligence into education alongside academic achievement, we can better equip individuals to thrive in an interconnected world. Culturally variant expressions of universal cognitive biases. We all have cognitive biases, mental shortcuts our brains use to make quick decisions. These biases exist universally, but the way they show up can vary based on cultural background. Culture shapes how we interpret the world, and this influences the way biases like confirmation bias, self-serving bias, or fundamental attribution error are expressed. Let's take confirmation bias. This is when we seek information that confirms what we already believe, ignoring anything that contradicts our views. In individualistic cultures, like the U.S., people tend to aggressively defend their opinions. If someone presents an opposing viewpoint, the individual might engage in debate to prove they're right. But in collectivist cultures, such as many in East Asia, confirmation bias shows up differently. It's less about winning the argument and more about maintaining social harmony. People might seek information that aligns with the group's views to avoid conflict. It's still confirmation bias, but it's shaped by the need to preserve group cohesion rather than personal validation. Another example is the self-serving bias, where we credit our successes to our own abilities, but blame external factors for our failures. In Western cultures, there's often a strong focus on individual achievement. If someone does well, they might say, "I succeeded because I'm smart." But if they fail, they'll point to external reasons like the test being unfair. In Eastern cultures, which prioritize humility and community, the self-serving bias looks different. People might downplay their successes to stay humble, but when things go wrong, they might attribute failure to the family or group. It's the same bias, but it's filtered through the lens of humility and collective responsibility. Then we have the fundamental attribution error, where we tend to attribute someone's actions to their personality, ignoring the situation they're in. In individualistic cultures, people are quick to judge others' behavior. If someone cuts in line or is late, they might think, "That person is rude." However, in collectivist cultures, people are more likely to consider the circumstances. They might think, "That person must be going through something," or "They had a valid reason." It's a subtle difference, but it's tied to the cultural focus on individual responsibility versus group context. Next is availability bias, which happens when we base our judgments on what information is most readily available to us. For example, after hearing about a plane crash, we might become more afraid of flying, even though statistically it's much safer than driving. In Western societies, the availability bias is often driven by sensationalized media. People fear rare events like terrorist attacks or robberies because these stories dominate the news cycle. In Eastern cultures, the bias can be influenced by community stories. If someone in the community experiences a tragedy, it might increase fear or caution about similar events. It's still availability bias, but the sources of fear are shaped by the collective experience rather than the media. Stereotyping is another common cognitive bias. In the U.S., stereotypes tend to focus on individual traits, like ambition or work ethic, because personal achievement is highly valued. In contrast, in collectivist cultures, where family and social group reputation matter more, stereotypes might be based on family background or social standing. It's not just about the individual, but how they are perceived through the lens of their community. The halo effect, where our overall impression of someone influences our judgment of their specific traits, is also shaped by culture. In Western cultures, the halo effect tends to focus on an individual's appearance or charisma. Someone who is attractive or charming might be assumed to be smart or kind. But in Eastern cultures, the halo effect often focuses on social standing. A person from a respected family might be seen as more competent or trustworthy, even without knowing much about them personally. These biases show us something important. While cognitive biases are universal, the way they are expressed is shaped by culture. The values, priorities, and social norms in our environment all influence how we see the world and how we interpret others' actions. And recognizing that is essential to improving cross-cultural understanding. The next time you're in a conversation with someone from a different cultural background, remember that their biases might be shaped by different values. It's not that they're biased in a wrong way. It's that their perceptions are influenced by their culture, just like yours are. Understanding this can help us become more empathetic and open-minded when interacting with people from different walks of life. Moral reasoning across religious versus secular value systems. Moral reasoning, the way we determine what's right and wrong, can vary greatly depending on whether someone follows religious or secular values. At first, the differences between the two might seem vast. Religious moral systems often rely on divine commandments, while secular systems focus on human welfare and reason. But even with these differences, both types of moral reasoning help people make ethical decisions in similar ways, even if the foundations are different. Let's begin with religious moral reasoning. In many major religions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, people turn to sacred texts for guidance on what is right or wrong. Christianity, for example, often points to the Ten Commandments and the teachings of Jesus. In Islam, followers rely on the Quran and Hadith. These teachings emphasize the importance of obedience to God and following the moral laws that come from these divine sources. In religious systems, moral reasoning is often centered around duty. For instance, in Christianity, following God's commandments is seen as crucial for spiritual health. Sin is viewed as a separation from God, and adhering to religious teachings is the way to restore that connection. Similarly, in Islam, moral laws are seen as the path to gaining favor with Allah and securing a place in paradise. Here, moral decisions are often about obedience to divine will, with consequences tied to a person's relationship with God. On the other hand, secular moral reasoning doesn't depend on religious beliefs or divine commandments. Instead, it's based on human welfare, reason, and the consequences of actions. Philosophers like Kant and Mill suggest that morality is about making decisions based on logic, fairness, and the welfare of others. Secular systems often promote human rights and justice, focusing on what benefits society as a whole. A key concept in secular moral systems is utilitarianism, which suggests that the best action is the one that results in the greatest good for the most people. Here, moral decisions are made by considering how they affect others and society as a whole. Secular reasoning prioritizes logic and human well-being rather than adherence to religious laws. Despite these differences, religious and secular moral reasoning often reach similar conclusions on many ethical issues. For example, both systems tend to agree that murder, theft, and lying are wrong, but the reasoning behind these moral judgments differs. In religious systems, actions like murder are seen as wrong because they violate divine commandments or disrupt one's relationship with God. In secular systems, such actions are wrong because they cause harm to others and disrupt social order. What's particularly interesting is that these two systems sometimes overlap in their application. For example, both religious and secular frameworks typically agree that lying is morally wrong. However, the justification for this might differ. In religious systems, lying might be condemned because it's seen as a violation of divine law. In secular systems, lying is often seen as morally wrong because it undermines trust and damages relationships. Despite these similarities, there are also key differences in how moral dilemmas are handled. One significant difference is that religious moral reasoning is typically about submission to a higher power. Religious moral frameworks often stress the importance of adhering to divine law, even if those laws are not universally accepted. Secular moral reasoning, on the other hand, emphasizes personal autonomy and decision, making based on reason and the consequences of actions. One example of this is how justice and punishment are approached. In some religious societies, punishment for crimes is often seen as a way to uphold divine law, with a focus on maintaining moral order according to religious principles. In contrast, secular societies tend to focus on rehabilitation and the idea that punishment should prevent future harm, often prioritizing reform over retribution. Another key distinction is the role of individual agency. Religious moral reasoning tends to emphasize obedience to divine will, while secular reasoning encourages autonomous decision-making, where people are encouraged to consider the impact of their actions on others and society. Despite these differences, both systems share a similar end goal: to promote behaviors that benefit society and individuals. Empathy, compassion, and justice are key values in both religious and secular frameworks. Both systems encourage people to make moral choices that lead to positive social outcomes. Cultural differences in dream content and interpretation. Dreams have long been a source of fascination, mystery, and interpretation across cultures. From ancient civilizations to modern psychology, the way we understand and interpret dreams reveals a lot about how we see the world around us. But did you know that dream content and its interpretation can vary significantly across cultures? What one culture might see as a good omen could be viewed as something entirely different in another. In many Western cultures, dreams are often seen through the lens of individual experience. For example, in the US and Europe, dreams are commonly interpreted as reflections of the dreamer's personal thoughts, emotions, and subconscious mind. The Freudian perspective, which is still influential today, suggests that dreams are a way for the unconscious to process repressed desires or unresolved conflicts. In this framework, a dream about losing teeth might symbolize a fear of aging or loss of control. The interpretation is focused on the individual, their personal anxieties, and what their unconscious mind might be trying to tell them. However, in many Eastern cultures, dreams are often seen as less personal and more connected to the collective or spiritual realms. For example, in China, dreams are often interpreted in relation to the balance of yin and yang, with certain dream symbols representing harmony or imbalance within the individual's life. In some cases, dreams are believed to be messages from ancestors or deities. In these cultures, dream interpretation might not solely focus on individual psychology but on spiritual well-being and the interconnectedness of the person with their environment and the cosmos. Similarly, in indigenous cultures, particularly those in North America and Australia, dreams often have a collective significance. In many Native American traditions, dreams are seen as a means of communication with the spirit world, where they can serve as guidance or warnings. Dreaming of a bear might be interpreted as a call for strength or a warning about an impending danger. These dreams are not just reflections of personal feelings, but are believed to carry messages that are meant to guide not only the dreamer, but also their community. One particularly interesting aspect of cultural differences in dreams is how they shape the content of dreams. In Western cultures, dreams often revolve around personal issues like relationships, work, or social status. A common dream theme in these cultures is falling, which is interpreted as a fear of failure or losing control. In contrast, in Eastern cultures, dreams might be more focused on natural phenomena, such as the appearance of animals or changes in the environment. For instance, in Japan, dreaming of a cat is generally seen as a good sign, often symbolizing fortune, whereas in Western cultures, the same dream might not carry the same positive interpretation. In African cultures, the content of dreams can often be more symbolic and tied to rituals and ancestral connections. In many African traditions, dreams are believed to be ways of receiving messages from the past or future. For example, dreaming of a deceased relative might be seen as a sign of guidance or a warning, depending on the context of the dream. This contrasts with the more psychological interpretations of dreams in Western settings, where such dreams might be seen as expressions of grief or longing for closure. What's fascinating is that while the content of dreams may differ across cultures, there are some recurring universal themes. For instance, flying is a common dream across many cultures, though it is often interpreted differently. In Western cultures, flying can be seen as a desire for freedom or escape from constraints. In African cultures, flying might symbolize spiritual growth or a journey to connect with higher powers. So, while the content of the dream may remain similar, the way it is interpreted can vary drastically depending on the cultural context. This diversity in dream interpretation is also reflected in how dreams are remembered. In some cultures, people are encouraged to remember and interpret their dreams as a way of connecting with the spiritual realm or understanding their own lives better. In contrast, in many Western cultures, dreams are often seen as fleeting, with little emphasis placed on remembering them unless they are particularly vivid or strange. In some indigenous cultures, dreams are so important that they are shared and discussed openly as part of community life, with elders interpreting the dreams of younger members. The way we react to dreams is also shaped by our culture. In cultures where dreams are seen as omens or messages, there's often a deep respect for their meaning and a certain level of reverence for dream interpretations. In contrast, in many modern Western societies, dreams are often dismissed as random or inconsequential, a byproduct of the brain processing daily events or anxieties. Despite these differences, the fact that dreams are so universally acknowledged across cultures speaks to something deeply human. While the content and interpretations of dreams vary, they all serve to help people navigate the complexities of life. Whether through spiritual guidance, personal reflection, or community connection, dreams continue to be a window into how we understand ourselves, our societies, and the world around us. Memory formation variations in oral versus written traditions. Memory formation is a fascinating process that shapes how we recall and store information. While we often think of memory as something that happens inside our minds, oral traditions and written traditions offer two distinct ways of remembering and transmitting knowledge. These traditions influence how people in different cultures remember and pass down information across generations. In oral traditions, memory plays a vital role in preserving stories, history, and culture. These traditions are commonly found in societies that rely on spoken word rather than written records. Oral cultures often have strong communal ties, where knowledge is passed down through storytelling, songs, rituals, and other forms of verbal communication. Because there are no written records to fall back on, people in oral traditions develop exceptional skills in memorization and verbal recall. This reliance on oral memory creates a culture where stories are reshaped and adapted by each generation, often to reflect contemporary values or concerns. One of the most important aspects of oral traditions is the emphasis on repetition. Stories are told and retold in communities, and each retelling can involve slight variations, adding new details or adjusting the message based on the storyteller's interpretation. This helps keep the story fresh and relevant, but it also means that the content is not fixed. Oral cultures tend to emphasize fluidity in memory, focusing on the overall themes and lessons rather than exact details. This variation can lead to different versions of the same story, depending on the storyteller and the audience's needs. In this way, oral traditions prioritize shared memory rather than individual recall, creating a communal approach to storytelling. In contrast, written traditions rely on physical records to preserve information. The advent of writing systems allowed knowledge to be recorded, stored, and passed down through written texts. In cultures with a strong written tradition, memory is often more static and fixed. Instead of relying on oral retellings, written texts provide a concrete reference that people can refer to whenever needed. For example, historical events, legal codes, or scientific knowledge are often recorded in written form, allowing these ideas to be preserved with a high degree of accuracy over time. The written word also provides a way to store large amounts of information that can be accessed by future generations without alteration. In written traditions, memory formation focuses less on personal recall and more on the ability to access and interpret written materials. Because written records provide a more permanent record of knowledge, they change the way people think about memory. In oral cultures, a person might be considered wise or knowledgeable based on their ability to recall stories or poems from memory. In written traditions, wisdom is often associated with the ability to read and interpret texts. Over time, this shift leads to a different way of thinking about learning and knowledge acquisition. People in written traditions might spend more time memorizing factual information from books and less time developing oral storytelling skills. An interesting aspect of memory in both oral and written traditions is how each influences individual versus communal memory. In oral traditions, memory tends to be more collective. The responsibility of remembering and passing down knowledge is shared by the community, and the accuracy of the information is often judged by the consistency of its retelling. In contrast, written traditions emphasize individual ownership of knowledge. A written text can be studied, annotated, and interpreted by individuals, allowing for more personal connections to the material. This individualistic approach can sometimes lead to more precise, but also more rigid forms of memory. It's possible to have a written record that remains unchanged for centuries, while an oral version of the same story might evolve in countless ways. The differences between oral and written memory are also reflected in how each tradition approaches truth and accuracy. In oral traditions, there is often more focus on thematic truth rather than strict factual accuracy. A story might be told in many different versions, each of which highlights different aspects of the narrative or changes the details to suit the audience. What's important is that the story captures the essential moral or lesson, rather than being an exact recounting of past events. In written traditions, however, there's a stronger focus on exactitude. The idea that a written record should be a faithful representation of what occurred. This shift towards precision can make written memory seem more objective, but it can also lead to a lack of flexibility in interpreting stories or events. In both traditions, memory is shaped by the way knowledge is passed down. Oral traditions prioritize adaptability and collective memory, allowing information to be shaped by each generation. Written traditions, on the other hand, preserve a more fixed record, enabling knowledge to be passed down through documents, books, and other written forms. Both approaches to memory have their advantages and limitations, and each plays a crucial role in how cultures preserve and transmit knowledge. Cultural transference in therapeutic relationships across power dynamics. When it comes to therapy, the relationship between therapist and client is crucial for healing and growth. One of the most important concepts in therapeutic relationships is transference. When clients project feelings, beliefs, and experiences from past relationships onto their therapist. However, cultural transference takes things a step further. Cultural factors like race, ethnicity, and societal power structures can play a huge role in shaping how transference shows up in therapy. Cultural transference refers to the ways in which cultural identity influences the therapeutic relationship. It's not just about individual experiences, but about how broader cultural experiences, like stereotypes, expectations, and historical tensions, affect the interaction between therapist and client. In a world shaped by power dynamics, cultural transference can be particularly significant. The way a client perceives their therapist and how they unconsciously place the therapist in a position of authority or resistance can often be colored by cultural factors that go beyond the personal. One of the first things to understand about cultural transference is how power dynamics play into it. Therapy often involves an inherent power imbalance. The therapist is seen as the expert, and the client typically looks to them for guidance and support. But this imbalance can be complicated when cultural factors come into play. For example, if a client belongs to a marginalized group that has historically been oppressed or mistreated by those in positions of power, they may bring that mistrust into the therapeutic space. A Black client might project feelings of anger, mistrust, or suspicion onto a white therapist simply because of the cultural history between their racial groups. Similarly, a woman of color might struggle with feelings of inferiority or powerlessness when working with a male therapist from a different background. The therapist's cultural background and their awareness of their own privilege or biases can influence the therapeutic process as well. A therapist who is aware of cultural transference may be more likely to recognize how their own identity, especially their power or status, affects the relationship. For instance, a white therapist working with a Latino client might need to be attuned to how their racial difference could trigger feelings of alienation or discomfort in the client. Without awareness of these dynamics, the therapist might inadvertently reinforce a power imbalance or misinterpret the client's reactions. In some cases, cultural transference can show up as idealization or devaluation of the therapist. The client may either elevate the therapist to an almost god-like status or devalue them completely. For example, a client from an Asian background who has grown up with the cultural expectation of honoring authority might overly idealize their therapist, seeing them as a figure of ultimate wisdom and guidance. On the flip side, a client who has had negative experiences with figures of authority might project resentment onto the therapist, rejecting their guidance or seeing them as untrustworthy or oppressive. But cultural transference doesn't just impact clients. It can affect therapists too. Therapists, especially those who are working across cultural lines, may also experience countertransference when the therapist projects their own feelings and biases onto the client. A therapist who is unfamiliar with a client's culture might unconsciously respond to them based on stereotypes, leading to misunderstandings or missed therapeutic opportunities. For example, a therapist might assume that a Middle Eastern client is conservative or traditional because of their cultural background, even though the client may hold more liberal views. This can affect how the therapist relates to the client, potentially creating tension or reinforcing cultural stereotypes. In many therapeutic settings, the key to addressing cultural transference is cultural humility. Cultural humility involves therapists being self-reflective about their own cultural biases, assumptions, and the power dynamics at play in the relationship. It also requires a commitment to lifelong learning about different cultural perspectives and an openness to understanding how those perspectives shape the client's experience. When therapists approach their work with cultural humility, they are better able to navigate the complexities of power and cultural dynamics within the therapeutic relationship, ultimately fostering a more inclusive and effective environment for healing. Therapists can also help clients become aware of how their cultural background impacts their perceptions of power and authority. By exploring these dynamics in therapy, clients can gain insight into how they relate to the therapist and to others in positions of power. For example, a therapist might work with a client to explore how their cultural upbringing has influenced their views on authority figures, helping them see how these views may affect their ability to trust others or form healthy relationships. Ultimately, cultural transference in therapeutic relationships is a complex and nuanced process. It involves not just individual experiences, but the broader social, cultural, and historical context in which these interactions take place. By acknowledging and addressing these power dynamics, therapists can create a more open and supportive environment where clients feel heard, respected, and empowered to heal. Decision-making frameworks across fatalistic versus agency-based cultures. Decision-making is a critical process in every culture, shaping how individuals and groups navigate their lives, relationships, and futures. Yet, the way people make decisions can vary dramatically depending on their cultural framework. Two of the most notable approaches to decision-making are fatalistic and agency-based cultures. These approaches reflect differing beliefs about control, responsibility, and the forces that shape our lives. Understanding the contrast between these frameworks can shed light on how individuals from different cultural backgrounds make choices and face challenges. In fatalistic cultures, Decision-making is heavily influenced by the belief that fate, destiny, or external forces govern the course of events. People in these cultures tend to view life as something that is beyond their control, where decisions are made in response to circumstances rather than proactive efforts to shape those circumstances. The core belief in these cultures is that events happen because they are meant to, and trying to exert too much control can be seen as futile or even disrespectful to the natural order. This mindset impacts decision-making in profound ways. For example, in a fatalistic culture, a person might approach a difficult decision, such as choosing a career path or making a life-changing move, by focusing on external signs or destiny rather than weighing pros and cons or actively pursuing options. They might look for signs in their environment or seek guidance from religious or spiritual leaders, trusting that fate will guide them in the right direction. In some cases, people in fatalistic cultures may even feel that decisions are made for them by higher powers or natural forces. This results in a more passive approach to decision-making, where individuals focus more on accepting what comes their way rather than trying to control or influence outcomes. On the other hand, in agency-based cultures, decision-making is grounded in the belief that individuals have control over their destiny and can shape their lives through deliberate action and personal choice. These cultures emphasize individualism and the idea that each person is responsible for their own future. Decision-making in agency-based cultures is often seen as a rational process where individuals weigh options, consider consequences, and make choices based on personal goals and values. In agency-based cultures, people tend to believe that success or failure is the result of individual effort. This belief in self-determination leads individuals to approach decisions with a sense of empowerment, believing they can influence the outcome through hard work, persistence, and strategic thinking. For example, someone from an agency-based culture might make a major life decision, such as pursuing higher education or moving to a new country. By creating a plan, setting clear goals, and actively seeking opportunities to fulfill those goals. In these cultures, the process of decision-making is often rational, strategic, and goal-oriented, with a focus on individual autonomy. One of the key differences between fatalistic and agency-based decision-making is the role of control. In a fatalistic framework, control is often seen as something external or out of the individual's hands. People in these cultures might be more likely to accept situations as they are, feeling that the universe or fate has already determined what is going to happen. In contrast, agency-based cultures place a high value on individual autonomy and the belief that one's actions can change outcomes. This leads people in agency-based cultures to feel a greater sense of responsibility for their decisions and their outcomes, whether good or bad. Another major difference between these two frameworks is how they deal with failure. In fatalistic cultures, failure is often viewed not as a result of personal shortcomings, but as something that was meant to happen. It is seen as part of the larger cosmic or spiritual plan, and people may interpret setbacks as learning experiences or signs to adjust their path. The emphasis is on acceptance and adaptation rather than on blaming oneself. On the other hand, in agency-based cultures, failure is typically viewed as a personal failing or a result of not trying hard enough or not making the right choices. There is often more pressure to fix the failure, learn from mistakes, and actively try to avoid repeating them. The social and cultural expectations surrounding decision-making in these two frameworks can also vary significantly. In fatalistic cultures, there may be stronger family or community influences on decisions, as individuals might look to others for guidance or approval, knowing that they are part of a larger, interconnected system. This sense of interdependence often plays a role in decisions about marriage, career, and lifestyle. In contrast, agency-based cultures tend to encourage independent decision-making, with a focus on personal fulfillment and individual desires. People in these cultures may be more likely to make decisions based on personal preference, even if it means going against social or family expectations. Ultimately, both fatalistic and agency-based cultures offer unique perspectives on how decisions are made and the role of individuals in shaping their futures. While fatalistic cultures emphasize acceptance of fate and the belief that the universe has a plan, agency-based cultures focus on individual control and the power of personal decision-making. These differing frameworks can shape everything from daily choices to life-altering decisions, influencing how people navigate the world and the challenges they face. Understanding these frameworks helps us appreciate the wide variety of approaches to decision-making and the diverse ways in which cultures navigate the complex interplay of free will, fate, and responsibility. Independent versus interdependent self-construal and cognitive processing. When it comes to understanding how people perceive themselves and relate to others, self-construal is a concept that sheds light on cultural differences in cognition. Self-construal refers to how individuals define themselves in relation to others, and it plays a crucial role in how people think, behave, and process information. There are two main types of self-construal: independent and interdependent. These self-construals are not just abstract ideas, but influence cognitive processing, how we perceive, reason, and make decisions in the world around us. In cultures that emphasize an independent self-construal, individuals are encouraged to view themselves as distinct entities, separate from others. In these cultures, people are taught to focus on their individuality, personal goals, and autonomy. For example, in many Western cultures like the United States or parts of Europe, the value placed on self-reliance, independence, and self-expression promotes an independent self-construal. People in these cultures are more likely to define themselves based on personal traits, achievements, and qualities, and their sense of self tends to be self-contained, not heavily influenced by the relationships they maintain with others. This independent self-construal affects cognitive processing in profound ways. Individuals with this self-view tend to engage in analytical thinking, focusing on dissecting objects or situations into individual components. They are more likely to process information in a linear, categorical way, breaking things down into distinct categories and focusing on their specific features. In an independent self-construal, people are more likely to focus on internal factors such as their own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, with less attention given to how they relate to the broader social context. For example, when faced with a problem, individuals with an independent self-construal may prioritize personal agency and individual solutions, concentrating on their own abilities and desires. In contrast, interdependent self-construal is rooted in cultures that emphasize connectedness and relationship-oriented thinking. In these cultures, often found in many Asian, African, and Latin American societies, individuals define themselves in terms of their relationships with others. The sense of self is seen as fluid, constantly shaped and reshaped by interactions with family, friends, and the larger community. People in these cultures are taught to place a high value on harmony, cooperation, and maintaining strong social bonds. Unlike in independent self-construals, where personal goals are prioritized, individuals in interdependent cultures often think in terms of group goals and collective well-being. Cognitively, this interdependent perspective leads to a holistic thinking style. Instead of analyzing things as isolated entities, people with an interdependent self-construal tend to look at situations from a broader, contextual perspective. They are more likely to focus on relationships, group dynamics, and the social environment when processing information. For example, when solving a problem, individuals with an interdependent self-construal might consider how their decision will affect the people around them, whether it will maintain harmony, and how it fits into the greater social context. Their thinking is more integrative, recognizing that individuals and events are interconnected and influenced by multiple factors. This difference in cognitive processing between independent and interdependent self-construals is particularly evident in how people approach social situations. For someone with an independent self-construal, the focus is on how they can stand out or assert their own identity in a situation. In contrast, someone with an interdependent self-construal is more likely to focus on how they fit in with the group or community and maintain harmonious relationships. This is particularly important when it comes to conflict resolution. For example, in Western cultures, individuals may approach conflict in a direct and assertive way, trying to resolve issues through individual expression. However, in East Asian cultures, people with an interdependent self-construal may prefer indirect or conciliatory methods, focusing on maintaining peace and avoiding open confrontation. These differing cognitive styles can also influence decision-making processes. In an independent self-construal, people tend to make decisions based on personal preference or individual goals, often weighing the pros and cons based on self-interest. In an interdependent self-construal, decisions are more likely to be made by considering family obligations, social expectations, and group harmony. This can lead to very different outcomes depending on the cultural context. For example, in a workplace setting, an individual from an independent self-construal culture might focus on personal career advancement, while someone from an interdependent self-construal culture might prioritize teamwork and the well-being of their colleagues. Despite the contrasts, both self-construals are valuable and functional within their respective cultures. Independent self-construals encourage individual initiative, self-expression, and personal responsibility, all of which can drive innovation and personal success. On the other hand, interdependent self-construals foster social cohesion, emotional support, and the ability to navigate complex social relationships, which are essential for maintaining group harmony and collective well-being. Understanding the differences between independent and interdependent self-construals helps explain cultural variations in cognitive processing, decision-making, and behavior. It reveals how our cultural upbringing shapes the way we think, act, and relate to the world around us. By recognizing these distinctions, we can appreciate how deeply our cultural context influences not just what we do, but how we do it. Whether we are thinking analytically or holistically, acting independently or interdependently,